In ancient Egypt, approximately 3,000 years ago, there existed a profound and elaborate belief system regarding what happened to the human soul after death, and central to this belief was a ritual known as the weighing of the heart, a ceremony that Egyptians believed every deceased person would inevitably face in the afterlife. According to their religious texts, particularly those found in the Book of the Dead, when a person died and journeyed to the underworld, they would be brought before a divine court presided over by Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, and there in that cosmic chamber, their heart would be physically removed from their body and placed upon a great scale or balance. On one side of this scale rested the heart of the deceased, that organ which Egyptians believed contained not merely the capacity for blood circulation, but also the essence of the individual's character, memories, emotions, and moral choices accumulated over an entire lifetime. On the opposite side of the scale sat a single feather, specifically the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, and this feather represented absolute moral perfection and righteousness. The logic behind this extraordinary system was that if a person had lived a virtuous life, treating others with kindness, honesty, and respect for the gods and the laws of society, their heart would be light enough to balance or weigh less than the feather of Maat, and they would be granted passage into the field of reeds, a paradise where they could live eternally in peace and abundance. Conversely, if during their earthly existence a person had committed sins, had been cruel, had lied, had stolen, or had violated the sacred principles of Maat in any significant way, their heart would be heavy, weighed down by the moral corruption accumulated through their transgressions, and it would tip the scale dramatically, far outweighing the delicate feather. When this occurred, a fearsome creature called Ammit, whose name meant devourer of the dead, and whose form combined the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, would consume the unworthy heart entirely, and this consumption meant complete annihilation of the soul, utter cessation of existence without possibility of resurrection or afterlife. This belief system persisted across Egyptian civilization for millennia, surviving through multiple dynasties and appearing consistently in tomb inscriptions, papyri, and artistic depictions, suggesting a deep psychological need among the ancient Egyptians to believe that morality mattered on a cosmic scale, that the universe itself kept careful account of human behavior, and that justice would ultimately be served in a realm beyond the visible world. In Chinese, Buddhist, and Taoist traditions, there exists a figure of profound significance at the threshold between life and death, a goddess named Mengpo who stands beside the bridge of forgetfulness, that crucial waypoint through which all souls must pass on their journey toward reincarnation. According to this elaborate afterlife mythology, before a soul can be reborn into a new body and begin a fresh existence on Earth, it must first drink from a bowl of soup offered by Mengpo herself, a mystical beverage brewed from the waters of oblivion and the essence of forgetfulness that has been accumulating for countless ages. This soup, the legend tells us, serves a singular and utterly essential purpose. It completely erases all memories of one's previous life, every relationship, every triumph, every trauma, and every lesson learned through decades or centuries of existence, leaving the soul as a blank slate ready to inhabit new flesh and experience existence anew without the burden of knowing what came before. The psychological mechanism behind this belief reveals something profound about how human consciousness grapples with the problem of suffering and the apparent injustice of the world. For if we remembered every past life, every previous failure, every moment of pain from our countless incarnations, existence would become unbearable, and the drive to live would be extinguished beneath the weight of accumulated sorrow and regret that would stretch across eternity itself. The goddess Mengpo thus becomes not a cruel torturer but a merciful figure, a compassionate guardian who understands that ignorance of one's past is actually a gift, a necessary mercy that allows each life to be experienced with fresh wonder and genuine stakes rather than the cynicism of someone who already knows how their story ends. What makes this mythology particularly enduring despite our modern scientific understanding of neurology and consciousness is that it speaks to a fundamental human anxiety about memory itself, about whether we are truly the same person from moment to moment, and whether our identity is truly continuous or whether we die and are reborn countless times within a single lifetime, forgetting pieces of ourselves that we can never retrieve. Even though we now understand that memory is a physical phenomenon rooted in neural pathways and chemical reactions, the metaphor of Mengpo's soup persists because it captures something emotionally true about the human condition, the way we cannot fully remember our childhoods, the way trauma sometimes hides itself from our conscious mind, and the way we all live with the haunting sense that something essential has been lost to the fog of time. In the remote, windswept plateaus of Tibet, where the earth lies frozen for much of the year and the air grows thin beneath endless skies, there exists a funeral practice so ancient and so fundamentally different from Western burial traditions that it challenges our deepest assumptions about death and the human body. This practice is called sky burial, known in Tibetan as jader, which literally translates to alms to the birds, and it represents not a morbid curiosity or primitive superstition, but rather a carefully considered theological and practical approach to the disposition of human remains that has persisted for over 1,000 years across the Tibetan Plateau and parts of Mongolia and Bhutan. When a person dies in these regions, the family does not immediately prepare the body for cremation or interment in the ground, but rather waits for several days, sometimes up to 4, while monks perform sacred rituals and recite prayers meant to guide the consciousness of the deceased through the intermediate state between death and rebirth, a period Buddhists call the Bardo. Once these initial ceremonies conclude, the body is wrapped in white cloth and carried, often before dawn, to a specific location known as a sky burial site, typically situated on a high mountain peak or isolated plateau where vultures and other birds of prey naturally congregate. They're trained practitioners called Rajyapas, who have dedicated their lives to this sacred work, methodically prepare the body through a process of careful dismemberment, reducing it systematically to fragments that can be consumed by the waiting birds, primarily Himalayan griffon vultures, which possess the remarkable ability to consume large quantities of human tissue, bones included, through their powerful digestive systems. The underlying logic of this practice emerges from Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, which teaches that the physical body is merely a temporary vessel, an empty container of no inherent importance once the consciousness has departed, and therefore preserving it through burial or embalming serves no spiritual purpose. While cremation, though practiced in some Tibetan communities, requires scarce fuel resources in an environment where wood is exceedingly difficult to obtain at high altitudes. Instead, sky burial accomplishes multiple purposes simultaneously. It honors the Buddhist principle of impermanence and non-attachment to physical form. It returns the body to nature in the most complete and efficient way possible, and it allows the deceased to make one final act of generosity by providing nourishment to living creatures, thereby generating positive karma for their journey through the afterlife. In the cosmology of the Aztec civilization, death was not an ending, but a beginning of an elaborate and perilous journey through a realm called Mictlan, a place so profoundly different from the Christian heaven or hell that would later dominate Mesoamerica that it reveals an entirely foreign way of conceptualizing what happens when the body ceases to function. Mictlan was understood as a vast underworld located far beneath the surface of the earth, a cold and shadowy domain ruled over by the god Mictlan Tecutli and his consort Mictlantecuhtli, deities whose very names literally meant Lord and Lady of the place of the dead. Unlike many afterlife systems that promised reward or punishment based on moral conduct during life, Mictlan operated according to an entirely different logic, one in which the journey itself mattered far more than any judgment of the soul. The Aztecs believed that when a person died, their journey to Mictlan would take precisely 4 years to complete, during which the deceased would face 9 different obstacles and trials of increasing difficulty. These were not moral tests, but rather practical challenges, environmental hazards that demanded persistence and the proper knowledge to overcome. The soul would encounter narrow mountain passes, fierce winds that cut like obsidian blades, and creatures designed to test not virtue, but resourcefulness and determination. This belief system was so concrete and literal that the Aztecs would bury their dead with specific objects called ofrendas, offerings that included food, tools, and maps of sorts, spiritual provisions meant to sustain the deceased through each phase of their underground descent. The psychological mechanism underlying Mictlan likely emerged from the Aztec understanding of life as a constant struggle against overwhelming natural forces, a worldview shaped by living in a challenging landscape where survival required constant effort and preparation. Death, in this framework, was simply another obstacle to overcome through proper preparation and knowledge rather than a final judgment or ultimate destination. What is remarkable about this system is how it persisted as a dominant belief, even as the Spanish conquest introduced entirely different Christian concepts of heaven and hell. and how elements of Mictlan beliefs actually merged with Catholic traditions rather than disappearing entirely, creating hybrid practices that still influence Day of the Dead celebrations throughout Mexico today, suggesting that certain frameworks for understanding death, once deeply embedded in a culture's worldview, prove surprisingly resilient even when directly challenged by foreign religious systems. In ancient Egyptian religious thought, the concept of the afterlife was intimately bound to the idea of moral judgment and cosmic balance, a framework that produced one of history's most fearsome and unusual consequences for the souls of the deceased. Deep within the mythology of the pharaohs existed a creature known as Ammit, a composite beast whose very name translates to the devourer or the eater of the dead, and whose sole purpose was to consume the hearts of those who had lived lives of wickedness and deception. This entity was not imagined as a traditional demon or evil spirit, but rather as an instrument of divine justice, a necessary component of the elaborate machinery that governed what happened to a person's soul after death. Ammit was typically depicted as having the head of a crocodile, the front body and mane of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, three of the most dangerous predators known to the ancient Egyptian world, combined into a single nightmarish form that embodied every threat that lurked along the Nile. The creature would wait in the Hall of Two Truths, that sacred chamber where the dead underwent their final judgment before the god Osiris and a tribunal of 42 divine assessors, standing guard as each soul's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. Should a person's heart prove heavier than the feather, burdened by the weight of their sins and transgressions, Ammit would step forward and devour that heart completely, erasing the individual from existence not merely for the afterlife but for eternity, denying them resurrection, denying them the chance to live forever in the field of reeds, denying them everything. The psychological mechanism behind Ammit's role reveals a sophisticated understanding of human motivation and social control, for the ancient Egyptians understood that people are more willing to behave morally when they believe that an absolute, inescapable consequence awaits them beyond death, a permanent and utterly irreversible consequence that cannot be bargained with or circumvented through any means. By creating this elaborate mythology around judgment and consumption, Egyptian priests and philosophers constructed a belief system that made ethical behavior not merely a social nicety or a religious suggestion, but an existential imperative, something that determined not whether a person would experience the afterlife, but whether a person would experience anything at all. What remains remarkable is how this concept persisted for thousands of years across Egyptian civilization, maintained and reinforced generation after generation, despite the obvious truth that no one could ever return to confirm that Ammit actually existed or that the judgment actually occurred. In the ancient Norse worldview, death was not a universal condition to be feared equally by all people, but rather a branching pathway that led to fundamentally different destinations depending on how one lived and died. For the warriors of Scandinavia, this distinction meant everything, as the concept of Valhalla represented not merely a pleasant afterlife, but an eternal continuation of the very existence they prized most in their mortal lives. Valhalla, meaning the Hall of the Slain, was imagined as a magnificent golden hall located in Asgard, the realm of the gods, where warriors who died in battle would find themselves transported upon their final breath, welcomed by the Norse god Odin himself, who presided over this eternal warrior paradise with careful attention to the martial virtues of those granted entry. The Norse people envisioned Valhalla as a place of unending abundance and activity, where the selected dead would spend their days engaged in endless combat, fighting one another with weapons that would never dull and wounds that would instantly heal, allowing the excitement and honor of warfare to continue perpetually without the finality or pain that characterized mortal conflict. Each evening in this afterlife realm, the warriors would feast together on endless supplies of roasted meat and mead, enjoying the company of the greatest fighters from across all of history, their camaraderie strengthened by shared participation in the most honorable pursuit a man could undertake. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system functioned as a powerful motivational framework for a warrior culture that depended on individual courage and martial prowess for survival and social status. By promising eternal reward specifically to those who died fighting rather than those who died of sickness or old age, the Norse belief system created a powerful incentive structure that encouraged young men to seek out combat, to embrace danger rather than avoid it, and to view death in battle as the ultimate achievement rather than a tragedy to be mourned. This afterlife belief served the practical function of reinforcing cultural values that the society needed to maintain. As a farming and trading people constantly threatened by harsh geography and rival clans, required warriors willing to fight without hesitation or self-preservation, instinct dominating their decision-making. What remains remarkable about this belief system is how thoroughly it permeated Norse culture, and how completely it normalized the idea that death in violence was preferable to death in peace, a concept that seems fundamentally at odds with human instinct, yet was accepted and celebrated across an entire civilization. Deep within the religious cosmology of the ancient Maya civilization lay a realm of profound darkness and complexity known as Xibalba, a underworld that existed not as a place of eternal punishment in the Christian sense, but rather as a necessary and intricate part of a cyclical universe where death and rebirth operated in perpetual harmony with one another. The Maya understood their cosmos as divided into distinct layers, with Xibalba situated beneath the mortal world as a shadowy domain ruled by the lords of death, powerful deities with names like Hun-Kame and Vukub-Kakwix, who presided over trials, transformations, and the ultimate fate of human souls. When a Maya person died, their journey did not end, but rather transformed into a descent through a series of progressively more dangerous and bewildering chambers, where the soul would encounter obstacles, demons, and tests designed not to torment for eternity, but to determine worthiness and facilitate passage into the next phase of existence. The concept emerged from the Maya observation of natural cycles in their environment, the way seeds must rot and decay beneath the earth before sprouting anew, and how the sun itself seemed to die each evening only to be reborn at dawn, creating a metaphysical framework in which death became understood as transformation rather than cessation. This underworld served a psychological function within Maya culture, offering explanations for the inexplicable suffering and loss that characterizes human existence, while simultaneously providing comfort through the assurance that death represented continuation rather than abandonment, that the souls of ancestors remained present and active within the cosmic order. Yet what remains remarkable about Xibalba's persistence in historical memory and contemporary cultural consciousness is how, despite the complete absence of archaeological evidence that Maya people actually experienced literal visions of this realm, or maintained these beliefs in the afterlife with unwavering certainty across all social classes and time periods, we continue to present these ideas as established historical fact rather than as theological interpretation. Allowing this ancient imaginative framework to persist in popular understanding as though it represented universal and unchanging Maya belief rather than one interpretation among many possibilities. The Popol Vuh, our primary written source for these beliefs, itself reflects the filtering lens of post-conquest Maya scribes who recorded oral traditions under Spanish colonial influence, reminding us that even our most authoritative accounts of Xibalba represent a particular moment in history rather than an immutable and timeless Maya truth. Deep within the religious traditions of ancient Persia, long before the modern world took shape, there existed a belief system centered on the cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. And this dualistic worldview extended even into the afterlife itself, culminating in one of history's most architecturally specific and psychologically detailed descriptions of what awaits us after death. The Chinvat Bridge, whose name translates to the Bridge of the Separator, or the Bridge of Judgment, was believed to be a supernatural structure that every soul must cross immediately after death, and this bridge possessed the extraordinary property of transforming its appearance and difficulty based entirely on the moral character of the person attempting to cross it. For the righteous and virtuous, the bridge would manifest as broad, stable, and easily traversable, sometimes described as wide as 9 spears or broader still, allowing the soul to walk safely across into paradise where they would be greeted by beautiful celestial beings and experience eternal happiness and light. Conversely, for those who had lived wickedly or sinfully, the bridge would transform into something far more sinister. It would become impossibly thin, sharper than the edge of a razor or a sword, and would tilt or crumble beneath the feet of the unworthy, causing them to plummet into the abyss of hell below where demons and torment awaited them for eternity. This belief system emerged from the teachings of Zoroaster, the ancient Persian prophet, and it represented humanity's deepest desire to create a cosmic system where morality and consequence were perfectly balanced, where no deed went unnoticed and no injustice went unpunished, and where the universe itself seemed to bend toward ultimate fairness through divine mechanisms. The psychological mechanism behind such a specific and detailed afterlife structure lies in humanity's profound need to externalize moral judgment into something tangible and undeniable, something that operates with mechanical precision and cannot be corrupted or argued with, unlike human courts and judges, which are fallible and subject to bias and manipulation. By placing judgment at the threshold of the afterlife itself, embedded into the very architecture of reality, the Zoroastrian tradition created a system where moral accountability becomes as unavoidable as gravity itself, where you cannot negotiate or bribe your way across, where only the truth of your character determines your fate. Among the Norse peoples of Scandinavia, the concept of death was not an ending, but rather a transition to another realm of existence, and this belief manifested itself most dramatically in the practice of ship burial, where the deceased, particularly those of high status or great renown, would be placed within a vessel along with their most precious possessions, weapons, horses, and sometimes even servants or slaves who were ritually killed to accompany their master into the afterlife. The ship itself served as both a tomb and a vehicle for the soul's journey, a floating gateway between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond, and the entire vessel would be set ablaze or deliberately sunk into the depths of a fjord or river, sending the departed warrior into eternity with all the material wealth and status they had accumulated during their earthly existence. The most famous example is the Gokstad ship, discovered in Norway and dated to around the 9th century, which contained the remains of a powerful chieftain surrounded by weapons, armor, shields, food, drink, and the bones of horses and dogs, all carefully arranged within the wooden hull as if the deceased might awaken in the next world and require these things for their continued existence and comfort. The psychological mechanism underlying this practice reveals a fundamental human struggle with the finality of death and the desperate human need to imagine that something essential about ourselves continues beyond the grave, that our identity, our status, our possessions somehow travel with us into whatever comes next, and that those we leave behind can influence our fate in the afterlife through the acts of reverence and devotion they perform at the moment of our departure from the world. What makes the Viking ship burial particularly striking is how this elaborate and resource-intensive ritual persisted for centuries despite having no empirical basis whatsoever, no evidence that the deceased would actually need or use these objects, no proof that burning or sinking a ship had any effect on the soul's journey or the deceased's status in the afterlife. Yet entire communities continued to invest enormous time, wealth, and labor into these ceremonies, destroying valuable ships, weapons, and resources in the conviction that doing so was absolutely essential to ensuring their loved ones' well-being in the realm beyond. Even today, we find this impulse normalized in our own funeral traditions, in the way we select expensive caskets, arrange flowers, display expensive jewelry on the deceased, and maintain elaborate gravesites, all rooted in that same ancient intuition that we can somehow serve the dead through material gestures, that our respect and our resources might somehow reach across the boundary between life and death. The concept of reincarnation suggests that the soul or consciousness of a person is reborn into a new body after death, carrying with it either memories, spiritual lessons, or karmic debts from previous lives, and this belief system has persisted across thousands of years and multiple continents, from the ancient Vedic traditions of India and the philosophies of Pythagoras in Greece to contemporary Western spirituality movements, where adherents report experiencing spontaneous memories of past lives, recognizing people they claim to have known in previous incarnations, or displaying inexplicable skills and knowledge that seem to have no origin in their current lifetime. The mechanism by which reincarnation supposedly functions involves the concept of the soul as a discrete entity that transcends physical death, remaining intact and conscious while cycling through successive physical vessels across centuries or millennia, accumulating experiences and spiritual development through each incarnation. And in Hindu and Buddhist frameworks specifically, the particular form one takes in the next life is determined by the accumulated karma from all previous existences, meaning that one's moral and ethical actions create an invisible ledger that determines whether you are reborn into circumstances of privilege or suffering, prosperity or hardship. What is psychologically fascinating about reincarnation belief is how it addresses fundamental human anxieties about mortality and meaninglessness, by suggesting that death is not truly an ending, but rather a transition, that our consciousness persists in some form, and that suffering and injustice in this life might be explained by actions committed in lives we cannot remember, thus providing a comforting narrative framework that transforms random tragedy into part of a larger spiritual progression. The persistence of reincarnation beliefs, despite the complete absence of verifiable scientific evidence or any plausible mechanism by which memories could transfer between bodies and brains, suggests something profound about human psychology, namely that we are deeply motivated to believe in continuity of self beyond death, to find meaning in suffering, and to imagine that our struggles now represent progress towards some eventual enlightenment. Making reincarnation less a claim about empirical reality and more a reflection of how desperately we wish for existence to be coherent, purposeful, and eternal. This psychological pull is so powerful that even in secular modern contexts, people gravitate toward reincarnation narratives in popular culture, past life regression therapy, and New Age spirituality, suggesting that the human need for cosmic justice and existential continuity may be more fundamental than our capacity for scientific skepticism. In Chinese, Buddhist, and Taoist tradition, the afterlife is not a single destination of reward or punishment, but rather an elaborate bureaucratic system overseen by 10 distinct courts, each presided over by a different judge, with the first court typically ruled by Yama or King Qinguang, who serves as the primary arbiter of souls. When a person dies according to this cosmology, their spirit does not immediately ascend to heaven or descend to eternal torment, but instead enters a complex process of judgment that unfolds across these 10 courts spread throughout the underworld, where each court examines different aspects of the deceased's life and assigns appropriate suffering or reward based on the specific sins and virtues recorded in the heavenly registers. The first court judges the most fundamental moral transgressions, while subsequent courts address increasingly specific categories of wrongdoing, from theft and murder to betrayal and sexual misconduct, with the 10th court determining whether a soul will be reincarnated and into what form of existence it will return, whether as a human, animal, or spirit. This system emerged from the practical reality that Chinese culture developed extraordinarily detailed bureaucratic hierarchies for governing the living world. And rather than imagining the afterlife as fundamentally different from earthly administration, religious philosophers simply projected the same structural logic onto the supernatural realm, creating divine magistracies that functioned precisely as earthly courts did, complete with record keepers, torture specialists, and appeals processes. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent belief involves the human tendency to conceptualize unknown or abstract experiences through the lens of familiar social institutions. And since the Chinese citizenry lived within elaborate governmental systems for centuries, imagining the afterlife as similarly organized made it comprehensible and less frightening through familiarity. What remains remarkable is how this framework endured even as actual governmental structures transformed radically across centuries, suggesting that once a cosmological system becomes embedded within cultural religious practice and artistic representation, it acquires a stability independent of the logical mechanisms that originally generated it, persisting instead through sheer repetition in temple art, literature, and ritual performance until it becomes simply the assumed structure of reality rather than a constructed theology requiring justification. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there exists an extraordinarily detailed and elaborate framework for understanding what happens to consciousness in the moments, days, and weeks immediately following physical death, a conception so intricate and precisely mapped that it reads almost like an instruction manual for navigating an entirely different realm of existence, and this framework is known as the Bardo Thodol, often translated into English as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Though this translation somewhat misrepresents the original intent and scope of the text. The Bardo Thodol describes 3 primary bardos, or intermediate states, that the consciousness experiences after death, beginning with the moment of death itself when the consciousness allegedly encounters what is called the clear light of ultimate reality, an indescribably luminous and all-encompassing state of pure awareness that offers what is essentially a final opportunity for enlightenment before the consciousness becomes confused and begins its descent into lower realms of existence. This initial bardo is said to last only a moment in external time, yet the deceased individual experiences it as an eternity of overwhelming brilliance and truth. And if the consciousness can recognize this clear light as the true nature of its own mind, then liberation is achieved instantaneously and the cycle of rebirth is broken. However, the text explains that most consciousnesses fail to recognize this ultimate state due to habitual patterns and lack of spiritual preparation, and thus they enter the second bardo, called the bardo of the peaceful and wrathful deities, during which the consciousness experiences visions of various enlightened beings and terrifying demonic forms that are said to be projections of the consciousness itself rather than external entities. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory appears rooted in the observation that human consciousness tends to interpret internal mental phenomena as external events, a tendency that becomes especially pronounced during moments of extreme stress, shock, or altered mental states. And the Tibetan Buddhist framework essentially argues that at the moment of death, when consciousness is severed from sensory input and neurological activity, it naturally defaults to generating vivid hallucinations based on deeply ingrained mental patterns, fears, attachments, and spiritual conditioning accumulated throughout the lifetime. In ancient Greek and Roman mythology, one of the most enduring and vivid images of the afterlife involves a figure known as Charon, a ferryman who operates a small boat across the river Styx, which serves as the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. According to these traditions, when a person dies, their soul or shade must be transported across this dark, murky river to reach the underworld, and Charon is the sole operator of this crucial passage, demanding payment in the form of an obol or coin, typically placed in or near the mouth of the deceased before burial. This concept emerged from practical observations of ancient river travel, where ferrymen were common figures in daily life, collecting tolls from passengers who wished to cross waterways that would otherwise be impassable or dangerous. The Greeks and Romans, living in societies where river crossings were essential to commerce and movement, would have naturally understood the metaphorical power of a ferryman figure as a guardian between two distinct worlds. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to connect to several human needs simultaneously: the need to understand death as a structured process rather than an abrupt ending, the need to maintain connection with deceased loved ones through ritual payment, and the need to impose order and commerce even on the most chaotic and frightening of human experiences. By imagining death not as a void, but as a journey requiring proper procedure, ancient peoples could exert a sense of control over something entirely beyond their influence. The toll itself represented a final transaction, a last act of duty and respect toward the dead, which provided mourners with concrete actions they could perform to ease their loved one's passage. What is particularly remarkable is how persistent this imagery has remained across nearly 3,000 years of human history, despite the fact that most modern societies have abandoned belief in the literal existence of Charon, the Styx, or the material necessity of coins for the dead. The figure and narrative continue to appear in literature, art, and contemporary media, suggesting that the underlying anxieties and psychological needs that generated the myth have never truly disappeared, even as our explicit belief systems have transformed dramatically. Modern retellings of the Charon myth in films, novels, and video games reveal how deeply the archetype resonates with contemporary audiences grappling with mortality, suggesting that our need to conceptualize death as a threshold to be crossed, rather than a cessation of being, remains as psychologically vital today as it was in ancient Athens. In ancient Greek mythology, the river Styx represented one of the most fundamental boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, a dark and turbulent waterway that souls were believed to cross in order to reach their final destination in the underworld. According to the classical accounts preserved in texts like Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid, this river was not merely a geographical feature of the afterlife, but rather a cosmic barrier that could only be traversed with proper preparation and payment, specifically a coin placed in the mouth of the deceased by their family members before burial. The ferryman Charon, a grim and aged figure who dwelt upon these shadowed waters, would demand this payment known as an obol before agreeing to transport a soul across the river, and those who could not pay were condemned to wander the shores for 100 years, unable to proceed to whatever fate awaited them beyond. The conception of this river emerged from the very real experiences of ancient Greeks living near actual rivers and bodies of water, which represented tangible thresholds in their own lives and journeys, and the psychological mechanism underlying this belief system appears rooted in humanity's need to establish clear, ritually defined transitions between one state of existence and another. Death itself is inherently ambiguous and frightening, lacking visible markers of transition. So the imagination of an actual river created a comforting structure where the passage from life to death became a concrete, navigable event rather than an abstract vanishing. Furthermore, the economic element embedded in the myth through Charon's fee reinforced the importance of proper burial practices within Greek society, creating a psychological incentive for families to invest resources in funerary rituals and ensuring social cohesion around these shared ceremonial obligations. What remains remarkable is how persistently this image has endured across centuries, despite our modern understanding that no such river or ferryman exists in any literal sense. And yet the river Styx continues to appear in contemporary literature, popular culture, and even casual conversation as a metaphorical representation of death's threshold. The enduring power of the river Styx demonstrates how mythological frameworks, once created to address fundamental human anxieties, transcend their original cultural context and become universally resonant symbols that speak to something deeper than any single civilization's beliefs about mortality and the afterlife. In this way, the river Styx transcends its origins as merely religious doctrine to become a universal language through which all cultures can articulate their own confrontation with mortality's finality. In ancient Egyptian belief, the afterlife was not a place of pure spiritual transcendence or divine judgment, as one might find in later Abrahamic traditions, but rather a continuation of earthly existence in a remarkably literal sense. The Egyptians envisioned a realm called Aru, or the Field of Reeds, which functioned as an idealized mirror image of the living world, complete with rivers, farmland, and all the necessary infrastructure for sustenance and labor. This was not merely a metaphorical paradise, but rather a physical location that required preparation, provisions, and ongoing maintenance through the living world's remembrance and ritual offerings. The deceased individual would need to navigate treacherous passages, recite magical spells, demonstrate moral worthiness before divine judges, and ultimately arrive at this field where they would spend eternity performing agricultural work, tending crops, and maintaining irrigation systems just as they would have done in life. To ease this burden, families would place shabtis, small figurines or servant statues, in tombs alongside the deceased, with the understanding that these magical representations would come to life and perform the required labor on behalf of the departed soul, effectively creating an eternal workforce that would prevent the deceased from engaging in actual manual toil. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system stemmed from the Egyptian inability or unwillingness to imagine a fundamental break from existence as they understood it. Death represented not an end or a transformation into something entirely alien to human experience, but rather a transition into a different mode of the same basic reality. The Egyptians, bound by their agricultural society's rhythms and their deep dependency on the Nile's seasonal flooding, could not conceptualize paradise in terms that did not involve the activities that define their waking lives. The eternal field represented security through familiarity. Even in death, one would know the tasks required, understand the environment, and feel competent in the work necessary to maintain one's existence. This perspective offered a peculiar comfort. Death was not punishment or incomprehensibility, but merely relocation to a place where the rules remained stable and predictable. What makes this belief system particularly striking is how it persisted across centuries of Egyptian civilization with remarkable consistency, suggesting that even as societies evolved and external knowledge expanded, the fundamental human need to render the incomprehensible into familiar terms remained constant and powerful. In Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions spanning thousands of years across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, there exists a profound and intricate vision of the afterlife governed by King Yama, the ancient deity of death and justice who presides over a celestial court where the deeds of every soul are meticulously weighed and evaluated. According to these deeply embedded theological frameworks, when a person dies, their consciousness does not simply dissolve into nothingness, but rather embarks upon a complex journey through multiple realms and dimensions where their actions during life are subjected to rigorous examination and judgment by Yama himself, a figure depicted in religious art and texts as a fearsome yet fair magistrate adorned with the symbols of authority and mortality. The mechanics of this judgment involve the concept of karma, a cosmic principle of cause and effect that operates independently of any personal desire or preference, functioning as an impersonal law of the universe wherein every action, thought, and intention generates consequences that must inevitably manifest either in the present lifetime or in subsequent cycles of rebirth and reincarnation. Souls are believed to be escorted to Yama's court by messengers or guides who record all details of the deceased person's life, presenting a comprehensive account that cannot be disputed or hidden. And Yama, with infinite wisdom and complete knowledge, determines the appropriate realm or dimension to which each soul shall be assigned based upon the accumulated balance of merit and demerit from their earthly existence. What makes this belief system particularly compelling and persistent across centuries is its psychological appeal to fundamental human desires for cosmic justice and moral accountability, offering reassurance that no cruelty goes unpunished and no kindness goes unrewarded, even if such justice cannot be observed in the visible world. The theory persists in modern practice despite scientific understanding of neurology and consciousness, because it addresses profound existential anxieties about meaninglessness and injustice in ways that rational explanations cannot, providing a comprehensive metaphysical framework that integrates morality, causality, and ultimate purpose into a coherent worldview that continues to guide the spiritual and ethical lives of billions of people worldwide. In Buddhist and Chinese religious traditions, there exists a category of spirits known as hungry ghosts, or preta in Sanskrit, which occupy a particular realm of existence between the living world and the deeper regions of suffering in the afterlife. These beings are said to have been reincarnated into this intermediate state as a direct consequence of their excessive greed, selfishness, or craving during their previous lives, and they are condemned to exist in a state of perpetual deprivation and torment where their appetites can never truly be satisfied. According to classical texts and religious teachings, hungry ghosts possess extremely thin necks and enormous bellies, a physical manifestation of their fundamental condition, and they wander endlessly through existence desperately seeking nourishment, water, or any form of satisfaction, yet finding that food turns to ash in their mouths and liquids evaporate before they can consume them. The tradition extends so deeply into these cultures that entire festivals, such as the Ghost Month celebrations observed throughout East Asia, are dedicated to appeasing these tortured entities by leaving out offerings of food and drink, performing rituals, and acknowledging their suffering in hopes of providing them some small measure of temporary relief from their eternal hunger. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears to be rooted in humanity's ancient understanding of moral consequence and karmic retribution, the intuitive human sense that excessive desire and selfish craving during life must inevitably lead to some form of punishment or restriction in the afterlife, creating a philosophical framework in which suffering becomes a natural extension of one's own character and choices. It functions as a cautionary narrative about the dangers of greed and attachment to material pleasures, yet it also serves a deeper psychological purpose by allowing people to conceptualize and rationalize the existence of suffering and unfulfilled desire as something that extends beyond the boundaries of earthly life itself. What remains particularly striking is how these beliefs have persisted and adapted across centuries despite the absence of any empirical evidence supporting their existence, and how entire cultural and religious practices continue to be structured around appeasing entities that have never been scientifically documented, suggesting that the hungry ghost concept fulfills something far deeper in the human psyche than mere superstition alone can explain. In ancient Greek mythology, the Elysian Fields represented something quite remarkable for its time, a pleasurable afterlife reserved not for the virtuous or the pious in a universal sense, but specifically for those who had been favored by the gods, those of heroic lineage, or those who had lived lives of extraordinary virtue and accomplishment. This concept emerged from Homer's epics and later Greek philosophical traditions, depicting a paradise situated at the ends of the earth where heroes and demigods would exist in perpetual happiness, forever removed from the suffering and toil that characterized mortal existence. The Elysian Fields were described as a place of eternal spring where flowers bloomed perpetually, where magnificent palaces stood in serene landscapes, and where inhabitants could engage in all their favorite pastimes for eternity without fatigue, hunger, or the degradation of old age. What made this theory particularly striking was its foundational inequality. The afterlife was explicitly stratified, with ordinary mortals consigned to shadowy underworld regions, while only the exceptional few would ascend to these blessed meadows. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system reflected the deeply hierarchical nature of Greek society itself, where aristocracy and heroism were considered fundamentally superior categories of human existence, and where the gods themselves operated according to favoritism and merit based on lineage and deeds. This afterlife model essentially projected earthly social structures onto the cosmos, suggesting that the divine order validated and perpetuated human inequality through eternity. What remains particularly interesting about the Elysian Fields is how this explicitly exclusionary vision of paradise has persisted in modified forms throughout Western culture, even as modern societies have ostensibly embraced egalitarian ideals, revealing how deeply embedded hierarchical thinking remains in our collective imagination of what an ideal existence should look like. Contemporary luxury communities, exclusive retirement destinations, and curated digital spaces marketed as escapes from ordinary life continue to echo this ancient logic, offering paradise not as a universal aspiration, but as a privilege reserved for those with sufficient wealth, status, or cultural capital to access them. In this way, the Elysian Fields remain not merely a historical artifact, but an enduring template through which human societies organize their fantasies of transcendence. In ancient Greek mythology, Tartarus represented not merely a location within the underworld, but rather a prison of absolute despair reserved exclusively for the most heinous offenders against the divine order, a place so profoundly distant from the world of the living that it required a fall 9 times longer than the journey from earth to sky, a descent that would take an anvil 9 full days to complete while falling continuously through darkness. The ancient Greeks, particularly through the writings of Homer and Hesiod, conceived of Tartarus as a realm where titans who had challenged the authority of Zeus faced eternal punishment, where beings like Kronos and his fellow rebels were chained behind walls of bronze, guarded by the 100-handed giants known as the Hecatonkers, existing in a state of perpetual torment that would never conclude. The psychological mechanism underlying this construct reflected humanity's deep need to establish cosmic justice through extreme punishment, a framework that allowed mortals to imagine that the universe itself possessed moral boundaries and that transgressions against divine law would result in consequences so severe that they transcended ordinary death and extended into eternity itself. This vision of Tartarus served a profound emotional function within Greek society, offering reassurance that the gods maintained absolute control over order, and that those who dared challenge celestial authority would face not temporary suffering, but endless imprisonment in darkness. The concept persisted throughout classical antiquity and subsequently influenced later religious traditions, including Christianity's conception of hell, demonstrating how powerfully the image of Tartarus embedded itself within human consciousness as a representation of ultimate punishment. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly this ancient imagining of eternal underground torment has survived despite our modern understanding of geology, physics, and the actual nature of planetary interiors. Yet the metaphorical power of Tartarus continues to shape how we imagine consequences, guilt, and cosmic accountability, suggesting that our need for a place where the most terrible offenders face unending suffering remains far more compelling than any rational argument against such a location's existence. Perhaps this enduring appeal lies in the recognition that some acts of defiance, whether against divine order or human civilization itself, demand a response so absolute and final that ordinary punishment seems inadequate, and in imagining Tartarus, we externalize our collective rage against those who would destroy the very foundations upon which society and morality rest. In the Catholic theological tradition, purgatory emerged as a distinctly peculiar afterlife destination, neither heaven nor hell, but rather a liminal space where souls undergo purification before reaching the presence of God, and this concept has shaped the moral anxieties and spiritual economics of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. The theory proposes that most human souls arrive at death in a state of imperfection, stained by minor sins or incomplete repentance, and therefore cannot immediately enter heaven, which demands absolute purity, nor do they deserve the eternal torment of hell, creating a philosophical middle ground that serves as a cosmic laundromat for the spiritually unclean. Those in purgatory experience purification through suffering, though the exact nature of this suffering remains vaguely described, sometimes imagined as fire similar to hellfire but temporary in duration. And the duration itself is theoretically indefinite, dependent on the degree of purification needed and remarkably subject to modification through the prayers of the living, particularly through the purchasing of indulgences or the commissioning of masses on behalf of the deceased. The psychological mechanism driving purgatory's acceptance lies in its elegant solution to a troubling problem. Most people intuitively sense they deserve neither infinite reward nor infinite punishment, that existence is morally complicated, and that death finds us perpetually incomplete, so purgatory allows for a kind of cosmic compromise where imperfection does not immediately result in damnation. Furthermore, purgatory created an economic function within the church itself, as families could reduce their loved ones' suffering through financial contributions, generating substantial revenue while simultaneously offering bereaved individuals a sense of agency and continued connection to the deceased through ongoing spiritual support. Despite lacking any scriptural foundation in the Bible itself, purgatory became so deeply embedded in Catholic doctrine that it shaped architecture, art, literature, and the spiritual landscape of medieval and early modern Europe, with artists depicting souls suspended in flames and theologians calculating with impressive specificity how many masses might shorten purgatorial sentences. In ancient Persian and Islamic theology, there exists a conceptual threshold known as the Bridge of Forgetfulness, or in some traditions the Bridge of Surat, which souls must cross in their journey beyond death, and upon crossing this ethereal structure, the departed experience a profound and irreversible erasure of their earthly memories and identities. The bridge itself is described as impossibly narrow, sharp as a blade in some interpretations, and suspended above an abyss of such unfathomable depth that the mind struggles to comprehend it, and those who walk upon it must leave behind every recollection of their previous existence, every emotion they once cherished, every relationship they once held dear, as if the very act of crossing severs all conscious connection to the life they previously lived. This theory emerged from a deeply human psychological phenomenon that therapists and neuroscientists now recognize as the mind's desperate need to explain the terrifying reality that consciousness simply ceases, that memories dissolve, that our sense of continuous self becomes fragmented and ultimately lost when the brain's chemical processes halt entirely. The mechanism behind this belief appears rooted in our observation of mortal forgetfulness itself, how easily humans lose memories even in life, how traumatic experiences sometimes vanish from conscious awareness, how we forget faces and conversations and the specific details of days that felt significant, and the afterlife becomes, in this framework, merely an extension of a forgetting process that has already begun within our living minds. What makes the Bridge of Forgetfulness particularly intriguing is that it essentially weaponizes our greatest fear about death, which is not the cessation of existence itself, but rather the erasure of meaning, the negation of identity, the horrible notion that everything we are will be unmade and dissolved. And yet, despite this deeply troubling vision of oblivion, the theory has persisted across centuries and cultures because it offers something paradoxically comforting. The idea that forgetting itself might be merciful, that perhaps the soul needs to release its burdens before moving forward into whatever comes next. In this sense, the Bridge of Forgetfulness transforms death from a punishment into a kind of psychological necessity, a merciful dissolution that allows the soul to shed the weight of accumulated grief, regret, and trauma that would otherwise follow it eternally. Perhaps this is why the image has endured. It suggests that oblivion, rather than being merely cruel, might actually be the universe's most compassionate answer to the question of what happens to suffering once we are gone. In ancient Norse cosmology, the Valkyries were not merely decorative figures in mythological tapestry, but rather served a deeply functional purpose within the warrior culture of Scandinavia, acting as supernatural beings who descended onto battlefields shrouded in mist and divine authority to select which fallen warriors possessed sufficient honor, courage, and martial excellence to be transported to the Great Hall of Valhalla, where they would spend eternity feasting, training, and preparing for the final battle of Ragnarök. The Norse people, living in harsh climates where survival demanded constant vigilance and martial prowess, developed an afterlife framework that explicitly rewarded violence and combat excellence, creating a cultural death wish of sorts where warriors genuinely hoped to die in battle rather than waste away from sickness or old age, since a death in service of conquest guaranteed divine selection and eternal glory. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system functioned as a powerful coping mechanism for a society where death was omnipresent, unpredictable, and often violent, allowing the Norse to transform the random brutality of battlefield mortality into a narrative of cosmic purpose and selection, where a warrior's death could be reframed not as a tragedy or accident, but as recognition of their worthiness by supernatural forces, thereby granting meaning to suffering and loss. The image of the Valkyries themselves, female warriors riding through clouds on winged horses, selecting the slain with an almost romantic gentleness, further softened the psychological blow of violent death by suggesting that even in the moment of annihilation, a warrior remained important enough to be personally chosen, personally recognized, and personally escorted to their eternal destination. What remains particularly striking is how thoroughly this belief persisted even as Norse society gradually converted to Christianity, with Valkyrie imagery and the concept of battlefield selection remaining embedded in Scandinavian cultural memory, in literature, in artwork, and in the collective imagination, suggesting that some myths endure not because they logically correspond to reality, but because they address fundamental human needs to believe that our deaths matter. That our struggle is witnessed, and that somewhere beyond this fragile existence, our sacrifices are remembered by forces greater than ourselves. In the spiritual cosmology of Aboriginal Australians, the concept of dreamtime, also known as the dreaming or dreamland, represents not merely a distant afterlife, but rather an eternal, simultaneous dimension that exists alongside and interpenetrates the material world we inhabit in our waking hours. According to this ancient system of belief that has persisted for tens of thousands of years across the Australian continent, all of creation, the mountains, rivers, animals, plants, and human beings themselves, was shaped during a primordial era when ancestral beings of immense spiritual power walked the earth and performed acts of creation that fundamentally altered the landscape and established the laws governing existence. These ancestral entities did not simply disappear or die in a conventional sense. Rather, they became permanently embedded within specific geographical locations, natural features, and the very fabric of the spiritual realm, remaining eternally present and accessible through ritual, song, dance, and meditative states that allow the living to commune with them. The mechanism underlying this belief system appears to function through a profound integration of landscape, memory, and spiritual consciousness, wherein the geography of the land itself becomes a living text inscribed with ancestral narratives, and by traversing these sacred sites through ceremonial songlines, individuals can access layers of meaning and power that connect them directly to the eternal dimension of creation. This system creates a circular understanding of existence wherein death does not represent an ending, but rather a transformation into the dream time, where the individual's spiritual essence rejoins the ancestral beings and contributes to the ongoing creative force that sustains all life. The persistence of dreamtime beliefs among Aboriginal communities, despite centuries of colonial suppression, forced assimilation policies, and the relentless encroachment of Western rationalism, speaks to something profound about human consciousness and our need to locate meaning within the landscapes we inhabit, and to understand ourselves as participants in a narrative far larger and more enduring than our individual lifespans. The ways in which these beliefs continue to structure Aboriginal law, art, kinship systems, and ecological knowledge demonstrate that what Western observers might dismiss as mythology functions instead as an integrated worldview that encompasses spirituality, history, psychology, and environmental stewardship in ways that modern compartmentalized thinking has largely abandoned, making dreamtime less a strange afterlife concept and more a radically different way of understanding the continuous nature of existence itself. Deep within Japanese Buddhist and Shinto tradition exists the concept of the Sanzu River, a mythological waterway that souls must cross immediately after death in order to reach the afterlife. And this river serves as both a physical and spiritual boundary between the world of the living and the realm beyond, functioning as a crucial passage that determines the trajectory of one's eternal existence. According to classical Japanese religious texts and folklore that have persisted for over 1,000 years, the Sanzu River is said to flow between our mortal realm and the land of Meadow, which is the Japanese underworld or purgatorial realm, and the crossing of this river is not a simple or uniform experience, but rather one that varies dramatically depending on the moral character and accumulated karma of the deceased individual. The mechanics of this crossing are remarkably detailed in traditional accounts, describing how virtuous souls will encounter a shallow ford or a helpful ferryman who can guide them safely across the waters, while those who lived immoral lives or committed grave sins will find the river swollen and treacherous, forcing them to wade through deep currents and struggle against spiritual obstacles that manifest as physical barriers to their passage. This theological framework emerged from a synthesis of Buddhist concepts regarding karma and moral accountability, combined with indigenous Japanese spiritual beliefs about the boundary between worlds, creating a uniquely Japanese interpretation of the afterlife journey that emphasizes personal responsibility and the consequences of earthly actions. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system relates to humanity's fundamental need to create cosmic justice narratives that explain suffering and reward suffering through tangible consequences. And by envisioning a river that punishes or rewards based on conduct, the Japanese cultural tradition provided believers with a compelling metaphor for understanding that moral actions have genuine, observable consequences even beyond death. What remains remarkable is how this imagery has persisted in Japanese cultural consciousness despite modernization and widespread religious pluralism, appearing in contemporary literature, anime, manga, and popular media as a cultural touchstone that connects modern Japanese people to ancient spiritual traditions, suggesting that even when we no longer literally believe in the Sanzu River's existence, we continue to find meaning and psychological comfort in its symbolic representation of life's moral dimensions and the human desire for justice in an often unjust universe. The Egyptian Book of the Dead represents one of the most elaborate and comprehensive guides to the afterlife ever constructed by human civilization, a collection of spells, instructions, and protective formulas that were meticulously inscribed on papyri and tomb walls throughout ancient Egypt for thousands of years, designed specifically to equip the deceased with everything necessary to navigate the perilous journey through the underworld and achieve eternal life in the realm of the gods. Rather than a single coherent text authored by one writer, the Book of the Dead was instead a compilation of various religious compositions that evolved across different periods of Egyptian history, with different versions containing different spells and instructions, yet all unified by the fundamental belief that death was not an ending, but rather a transition into another mode of existence that required careful preparation and specific knowledge to traverse successfully. The ancient Egyptians envisioned the afterlife as an extraordinarily complex landscape filled with demons, guardians, gates, and challenges that could only be overcome through memorizing precise spells and passwords, through demonstrating moral purity, and through possessing objects of power, which is why wealthy individuals would commission elaborate copies of these texts to be buried alongside them, ensuring that their souls would have access to this essential information when they needed it most. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system appears rooted in humanity's fundamental inability to accept the permanence of death and the deep-seated need to construct elaborate narratives that transform mortality into a manageable obstacle rather than an absolute ending, allowing the living to feel that they retain some agency and control over what happens to their consciousness after their bodies cease to function. What makes the Book of the Dead particularly remarkable is not merely that ancient Egyptians believed in such an elaborate afterlife, but rather that this belief system was so thoroughly normalized and institutionalized within their entire civilization that virtually everyone participated in acquiring these texts, regardless of social class, suggesting that the comfort provided by having detailed instructions for the unknowable was so profound that no amount of skepticism could diminish its appeal. In Norse mythology, existing alongside the more celebrated halls of Valhalla and Hel, there existed a realm known as Folkvangr, a field or meadow of equally profound spiritual significance that served as an alternative destination for the honored dead in the afterlife. This concept emerged from the ancient Norse understanding that not all warriors who died in battle could possibly fit within the golden halls of Valhalla, which was presided over exclusively by the god Odin and his Valkyries. And thus the goddess Freyja, one of the most revered deities in the Norse pantheon, was said to receive half of all those who fell honorably in combat, welcoming them instead to her own magnificent realm where they would spend eternity in peace, feasting, and companionship. The psychological mechanism underlying Folkvangr appears to stem from a deeply human need to create hierarchies and structures even within systems of reward and punishment, suggesting that ancient Norse peoples could not conceive of an afterlife that lacked complexity, competition, or competing authorities. And this division of the honored dead between two powerful deities may have reflected the complex social and religious structures of Norse society itself, where power was always distributed among multiple figures rather than consolidated in a single ruler. The concept also functioned as a form of social comfort, assuring ordinary people and those who did not meet the specific criteria for Valhalla that their deaths would still carry meaning and honor, that they would not be forgotten or condemned to obscurity simply because their final moments did not align with Odin's exacting standards. And this egalitarian impulse within an otherwise martial culture speaks to a fundamental human resistance against complete exclusion from dignity and recognition after death. What remains remarkable about Folkvanger is how thoroughly it has faded from popular consciousness despite its theological importance in Norse religion, overshadowed almost entirely by Valhalla in modern popular culture, video games, and contemporary interpretations of Norse mythology, suggesting that even the afterlife narratives we inherit are subject to the same forces of cultural selection and forgetting that govern all other aspects of history. And that the stories we tell about death are ultimately determined not by their logical consistency, but by their dramatic appeal and cultural utility in each successive era. In the mythology of the ancient Norse peoples, there existed a realm of the afterlife called Hel, named after its ruler, a goddess of the same name who is said to be half living and half dead in appearance, her body divided between the colors of flesh and corpse. This realm was not conceived as a place of eternal punishment in the manner of Christian hell, but rather as a destination for those who died of sickness, old age, or accident, a neutral ground that stood in contrast to the glorious halls of Valhalla, where warriors who fell in battle were believed to be taken by the Valkyries to feast and fight eternally alongside the god Odin. The Norse understood Hel as a physical location situated beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that held all existence together, and it was described as a cold, dark place where the dead inhabited a hall called Eldjidnir, where they consumed meals from a table called hunger and slept on beds of sickness. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system reveals itself when we consider how Norse societies, living in the harsh climates of Scandinavia where death from disease and exposure was commonplace, and battles between clans were frequent, needed to create a framework that honored different types of death appropriately and provided their people with a narrative in which no form of death was entirely shameful or hopeless. By establishing that warriors who died in combat achieved a special status, while those who died ordinary deaths still had a structured afterlife rather than complete oblivion, the Norse managed to both motivate martial courage while simultaneously accepting the reality that most of their population would die through nonviolent means, thus providing psychological comfort across all segments of society. What persists as remarkable about this belief system is how thoroughly it integrated itself into Norse worldview despite having no observable basis, and how it served the practical function of creating social cohesion by ensuring that every possible form of death carried meaning and narrative weight, allowing families to accept loss more readily when they could frame it within a cosmological system that denied no one an afterlife. The veneration of Hel herself, a figure neither wholly malevolent nor benevolent, further demonstrates how the Norse resisted the dualistic moral frameworks that would later dominate Western thought, instead embracing a more nuanced understanding in which death was an inevitable natural force deserving respect rather than fear or condemnation. In this way, the goddess Hel became not a figure of terror, but a necessary counterbalance to the warrior ideals celebrated elsewhere in Norse cosmology, a reminder that all beings, regardless of their earthly deeds, would eventually answer to her dominion. In the religious and philosophical traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, there exists a concept so fundamental to their understanding of existence that it has shaped the spiritual lives of billions of people across millennia, and this concept is known as samsara, which literally translates to wandering or flowing through, describing an endless cycle of death and rebirth from which all sentient beings suffer until they achieve liberation through enlightenment or spiritual awakening. The real-life situation that samsara addresses is the observable reality that all living things experience birth, growth, decay, and death. And in these traditions, this cycle is not viewed as a singular journey, but rather as an infinite repetition, where consciousness or the soul, depending on one's particular interpretation, is reborn into new bodies again and again across countless lifetimes. Trapped in a perpetual wheel of suffering that spans epochs and generations far beyond what the human mind can adequately comprehend. The mechanism underlying this belief system operates on the principle of karma, which functions as a cosmic law of moral causation, suggesting that the actions taken in one lifetime directly determine the circumstances and quality of existence in the next lifetime, creating an intricate system where past deeds accumulate as karmic debt or credit. Theoretically explaining the vast inequalities and differences in human experience that we observe in the present world without needing recourse to chance or randomness. This framework provides a logical explanation for suffering, inequality, illness, and hardship by suggesting that these conditions are not arbitrary but rather earned consequences of past actions, either from the current lifetime or from previous incarnations that the conscious mind has simply forgotten, thereby transforming the randomness of human tragedy into a comprehensible moral universe governed by just principles. What makes samsara particularly remarkable in its persistence throughout human history is that it continues to be accepted and taught despite having no empirical evidence, no measurable mechanisms of karmic transfer, and no verifiable method by which memories or moral consequences could transfer between bodies or across the vast gulf of death and rebirth. Yet these ideas remain deeply embedded in the spiritual worldviews of over 1 billion people who structure their entire ethical systems. Life choices and understanding of suffering around its validity, suggesting that the human need for order, justice, and explanation in a chaotic world can sustain even the most elaborate metaphysical systems indefinitely. In the vast spiritual traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, there exists a concept of liberation so profound and so central to the entire religious framework that billions of people have oriented their entire lives around its pursuit. And that concept is known as moksha, which literally translates to liberation or release from the cyclical wheel of existence known as samsara. Unlike many Western afterlife theories that propose an eternal destination such as heaven or hell, moksha represents something far more radical and paradoxically more subtle. The complete cessation of the self, the dissolution of individual consciousness into the infinite, undifferentiated absolute reality known as Brahman, and the permanent escape from the endless cycle of rebirth that characterizes all existence. The philosophical mechanism underlying moksha rests upon the fundamental Hindu understanding that what we perceive as our individual identity, our ego, our persistent sense of self that seems so real and so essential to our experience, is in fact an illusion, a cosmic misunderstanding created by ignorance, and that beneath this false layer of individuality lies a singular, eternal, unchanging universal consciousness that has always existed and from which all things arise and into which all things eventually dissolve. The path to achieving moksha involves rigorous spiritual practice, ethical living, meditation, study of sacred texts, and the cultivation of wisdom that gradually erodes the boundaries between the individual self and the universal whole, until finally, in a moment of transcendent realization, the seeker directly experiences their fundamental identity with Brahman and understands with absolute certainty that they were never separate from it. What persists in these traditions, despite the inherent difficulty and seemingly impossible nature of the goal, is an unwavering faith that such liberation is not merely possible but inevitable, that every soul will eventually return home to its source, and that the spiritual practices and ethical frameworks built around this belief serve a legitimate purpose in accelerating consciousness toward this ultimate realization, transforming how people understand suffering, meaning, and their relationship to existence itself across countless generations. The concept gained particular urgency in traditions like Advaita Vedanta, where the recognition of one's identity with Brahman could theoretically occur in a single lifetime, making moksha not a distant reward but an immediately accessible awakening that transforms the practitioner's experience of reality even while living in the world. In Buddhist and Hindu cosmological thought, the concept of the 6 realms represents a cyclical afterlife framework where consciousness is reborn into one of 6 distinct planes of existence based entirely on the accumulated karma from previous lives, each realm corresponding to different emotional and spiritual states that an individual has cultivated through their actions, thoughts, and desires during their earthly existence. The highest realm is the realm of the devas, or gods, where beings experience extraordinary pleasure and longevity, but eventually face the inevitable decline that comes from exhausting their positive karma, followed by the realm of the asuras, often described as jealous titans or demigods who possess power and long lifespans but are trapped in constant conflict and dissatisfaction. Then the human realm. Considered uniquely positioned because humans possess both suffering and the capacity for enlightenment in ways that other realms do not allow. then the animal realm, where consciousness inhabits bodies driven primarily by instinct and survival, then the hungry ghost realm, populated by beings consumed by insatiable cravings and desires that can never be satisfied, and finally the hell realm. Not as an eternal punishment, but as a temporary state of intense suffering where consciousness experiences the consequences of its most destructive actions before eventually working through that karma and being reborn elsewhere. The psychological mechanism operating beneath this system reflects a sophisticated understanding of how emotional patterns, habitual thinking, and behavioral patterns create self-reinforcing cycles that feel inescapable, where a being trapped in the hungry ghost realm experiences their own endless craving as the fundamental architecture of their reality, and a deity in the realm of the gods exists in such blissful ignorance that they fail to prepare for the inevitable downfall, making each realm not merely a location, but a state of consciousness that perpetuates itself through the being's own internal structure. What makes the six realms persist despite its lack of physical evidence or scientific verification is precisely how accurately it maps onto human psychological experience, how readily we recognize ourselves cycling through these states even within a single day or single lifetime, how poverty and desperation can feel like the hungry ghost realm, while moments of arrogant superiority echo the Asura realm's jealous dissatisfaction, and how thoroughly the system accounts for suffering without requiring external judgment or punishment, instead placing the mechanism of consequence entirely within the individual's own karma, their own choices, their own patterns, rendering it simultaneously inescapable and entirely self-created. In the ancient Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies that emerged across South Asia thousands of years ago, there exists a category of realms known as Naraka, which translates quite literally to hell or underworld, though the concept bears little resemblance to the fiery Christian inferno that would later dominate Western imagination. Rather, Naraka represents a vast taxonomy of suffering states, a meticulously detailed bureaucracy of punishment realms organized according to the specific transgressions committed during one's earthly existence, where the duration and intensity of torment are calibrated with mathematical precision to match the moral weight of each transgression. These realms range from the merely unpleasant to the genuinely horrifying, featuring everything from realms of intense cold, where beings freeze eternally, to realms of scalding heat, realms where bodies are continuously crushed and regenerated only to be crushed again, and realms populated by demons and torturers whose sole purpose is the administration of suffering according to divine ledgers that track every action, every word, and every thought with absolute accuracy. The psychological mechanism underlying Naraka operates through a profound need for cosmic justice and moral equilibrium, a deeply human impulse to believe that the universe maintains perfect accounting, where no cruelty goes unremarked and no kindness goes unrewarded, functioning as a deterrent against antisocial behavior by suggesting that the consequences for wrongdoing extend far beyond mere earthly punishment into eternal realms where escape becomes impossible. What makes Naraka particularly remarkable as a persistent belief system is that despite the advancement of neuroscience, the development of secular legal systems, and the general erosion of religious certainty in modern societies, millions of people across India, Nepal, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and other regions continue to structure their moral lives around the assumption that this invisible accounting system operates constantly in the background, making decisions about dietary choices, sexual conduct, financial dealings, and interpersonal honesty based partly on beliefs about karmic consequences that will determine their next birth or their eternal punishment in realms they will never see but somehow know with certainty exist. This persistence suggests that Naraka functions less as a literal geographical map of the afterlife and more as a cultural technology for encoding ethical behavior into the deepest layers of consciousness, a mechanism so effective that it survives the dissolution of the literal cosmological framework that originally spawned it, continuing to shape behavior and belief even among those who intellectually reject its metaphysical premises. In Islamic theology, there exists a concept known as barzakh, an Arabic term that translates roughly to barrier or partition, which describes an intermediate realm that exists between the moment of death and the day of final judgment, a liminal space where the soul is believed to remain in a state of waiting, neither fully in the material world nor yet in the eternal paradise or hellfire that awaits humanity's ultimate reckoning. According to classical Islamic sources, particularly Hadith traditions and Quranic interpretation, When a person dies, their body is placed in the grave while their soul enters this mysterious realm of Barzakh, where it experiences either comfort or torment depending on the righteousness of the life they led. And this intermediate period lasts from the moment of death until the resurrection on Judgment Day, which Muslims believe will eventually come when Allah decrees it. The concept of Barzakh fundamentally addresses a profound existential problem that has plagued human consciousness throughout history. The uncomfortable gap between death and whatever comes after, the troubling space where we cannot see, cannot measure, and cannot verify what happens to the essence of a person once their body ceases to function. This theological invention serves a psychological purpose by filling an unbearable void of uncertainty with a structured narrative, offering believers a detailed map of an unmappable territory, transforming the terrifying unknown into a comprehensible framework where souls are judged, evaluated, and positioned in preparation for their eternal destination. The mechanism underlying Barzakh's persistence is partly rooted in humans' fundamental need to construct continuity from the discontinuity of death, to imagine that consciousness does not simply cease, but instead transitions into another mode of existence where memories persist, where accountability matters, and where the moral weight of one's choices continues to have consequences. Despite having no empirical evidence whatsoever, despite the complete absence of any scientific method by which we might verify or measure this intermediate realm, despite the impossibility of communicating with souls supposedly residing there, the concept of Barzakh remains deeply embedded in Islamic faith and practice, influencing how millions of people approach death, dying, and the treatment of the deceased. In Islamic theology, Jannah represents the ultimate paradise that awaits the righteous in the afterlife, a concept that has shaped the spiritual aspirations and moral frameworks of nearly 2 billion Muslims across the globe for over 14 centuries. The detailed descriptions of Jannah found throughout the Quran and Hadith literature paint an extraordinarily vivid picture of eternal reward, featuring gardens of unimaginable beauty where rivers flow with water, milk, honey, and wine that never intoxicates, where fruits hang low enough to be plucked effortlessly, and where believers recline upon thrones of silk cushioned with the finest materials known to creation. The sensory experiences promised in Jannah extend beyond mere physical comfort to encompass emotional and spiritual fulfillment that transcends earthly understanding, including the promised meeting with the divine presence, the companionship of loved ones, and freedom from pain, sorrow, disease, and all forms of suffering that plague human existence. The psychological mechanism underlying the powerful appeal of Jannah lies in its function as a comprehensive answer to the fundamental human anxieties about mortality, injustice, and the apparent meaninglessness of suffering, offering believers a reassuring narrative in which their earthly struggles and sacrifices possess cosmic significance and will be ultimately vindicated through eternal reward. By promising that virtuous deeds performed in this temporary life will yield infinite returns in the permanent afterlife, Jannah transforms the believer's relationship to present suffering, reframing hardship as a test or investment rather than pointless tragedy, which provides psychological comfort and moral motivation that sustains commitment to religious practice and ethical living. The persistence and normalization of Jannah within Muslim communities reflects a sophisticated theological structure that has become deeply embedded in cultural practice, artistic expression, funeral rituals, and moral education across diverse Islamic societies, where descriptions of paradise have been reinforced through centuries of poetry, architecture, calligraphy, and scholarly commentary that has made these otherworldly visions feel almost as tangible as memories of actual places. The architectural splendor of Islamic gardens throughout history, from the Alhambra in Spain to the Taj Mahal in India, can be understood partly as earthly attempts to manifest Jannah's aesthetic ideals, while the recitation of Quranic verses describing paradise in moments of grief or contemplation demonstrates how these theological concepts serve as living spiritual practices that continue to shape Muslim experience across generations and geographies. Deep within the ancient religious traditions of Persia, long before the rise of Islam and Christianity as the dominant faiths of the Middle East, existed a remarkably sophisticated vision of the end times known as Frashokereti, a concept that translates literally to making wonderful or the final renewal. This Zoroastrian eschatological framework presented a vision of cosmic restoration in which the universe itself would undergo a complete and total transformation, moving from a state of imperfection and corruption toward ultimate perfection and wholeness, a journey that would unfold over millennia according to carefully delineated cosmic ages. The mechanism underlying this belief system rested on a profound dualistic understanding of existence, in which all of reality remained locked in an eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of wisdom and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of chaos and darkness, with the fate of all souls and the material world hanging in the balance between these two cosmic forces. At the appointed end of time, Zoroastrians believed that a final savior figure called the Saoshyant would be born of a virgin impregnated by the preserved seed of Zarathustra himself. And this messianic figure would lead humanity through a series of transformative trials, including a purifying molten metal flow that would cleanse all evil from existence while leaving the righteous unharmed. The psychological appeal of Frashokereti lay in its provision of absolute moral certainty and cosmic justice, assuring believers that no matter how much suffering or injustice plagued the present world, ultimate victory for goodness was mathematically guaranteed by the structure of the universe itself. And furthermore, that individual moral choices during life would directly determine one's position in the reconstituted paradise that would follow. This framework proved so influential that it fundamentally shaped later Abrahamic religious thought, with its concepts of resurrection, final judgment, heaven and hell, and apocalyptic renewal appearing throughout Christian and Islamic theology in forms that betray their Zoroastrian origins. Yet despite the lack of empirical evidence for any cyclical cosmic destruction and renewal, despite the complete absence of verifiable signs that such events approach, and despite the profound logical difficulties inherent in describing states beyond normal causality in physics, these Zoroastrian concepts persist in modified form across billions of modern believers who have often forgotten their ancient Persian source. In ancient Hebrew theology, long before the development of more elaborate afterlife cosmologies in later Jewish and Christian traditions, there existed a concept known as Sheol, a shadowy and somewhat indistinct realm that served as the destination for all the dead regardless of their moral standing or righteousness during their earthly lives. Sheol was not conceived as a place of punishment in the manner of later Christian hell, nor was it imagined as a paradise reserved for the virtuous like the Christian heaven, but rather as a kind of universal grave, a hollow underground cavity where the dead existed in a state of diminished consciousness, often described in biblical texts as a realm of darkness, silence, and profound separation from the living world and the presence of God. The dead in Sheol were thought to inhabit a gray, featureless existence where they remained largely inactive and forgotten, neither suffering acute torment nor experiencing joy, but instead existing in a kind of perpetual twilight state that was neither fully conscious nor completely extinguished. This concept emerged from the particular historical and cultural circumstances of ancient Hebraic societies, where the focus of religious life remained intensely centered on the present earthly existence and the fulfillment of covenant obligations within the community, leaving relatively little theological attention directed toward speculations about what might occur after death. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system reflects a profound discomfort with the finality of death and the human need to imagine some form of continued existence, however diminished or unsatisfying, rather than confront the possibility of complete annihilation and non-existence. By envisioning an afterlife realm, even one as dreary and uninviting as Sheol, ancient Hebrew thought managed to address existential anxiety, while simultaneously avoiding the need to develop complex moral justifications for why good people suffered in life and evil people sometimes prospered, since both would ultimately end up in the same gray realm regardless. What remains remarkable about Sheol is how completely it has been superseded and forgotten in popular consciousness by more vivid and psychologically compelling afterlife theories, despite its historical primacy in Judeo-Christian tradition, and how thoroughly contemporary religious thought has abandoned this neutral middle ground in favor of stark binary systems of ultimate reward and punishment that demand much more elaborate theological scaffolding to justify their existence. Yet this displacement of Sheol by heaven and hell represents not merely an evolution in religious thought, but a fundamental shift in how human societies came to understand moral accountability and divine justice itself. Limbo represents one of the most poignant and peculiar concepts in Christian theology, a place that exists in the uncomfortable space between salvation and damnation, where souls reside in a state of natural happiness yet eternal separation from the divine presence of God, and this doctrine emerged primarily from the medieval Catholic Church's attempt to reconcile the fate of virtuous pagans and unbaptized infants with the rigid requirements of Christian salvation, creating what theologians called the limbus infantum for children who died before receiving the sacrament of baptism, and the limbus patrum for the righteous souls of the Old Testament who existed before Christ's redemptive sacrifice. The psychological mechanism driving this concept stems from humanity's profound discomfort with absolute moral categories and our need to construct intermediate spaces that acknowledge nuance and fairness in divine judgment, because the alternative scenarios presented genuine theological problems. Condemning unbaptized babies to hell seemed unconscionable even to medieval minds, yet admitting them to heaven without baptism appeared to contradict explicit scriptural passages about the necessity of baptismal rebirth. Limbo thus functioned as a conceptual pressure valve, a way to hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously by creating a third location where these souls could exist in peace and even contentment, albeit separated forever from the beatific vision that defined heaven itself. What persists most strangely about limbo across centuries is how it gradually faded from official doctrine almost without notice, as the Catholic Church quietly de-emphasized and eventually abandoned the concept in the 20th century, acknowledging that it had always been speculative theology rather than revealed truth. Yet the emotional weight and narrative function of limbo remained embedded in Western culture, literature, and imagination long after its theological scaffolding crumbled, suggesting that we had become so attached to this middle ground that we continued inhabiting it conceptually even after religious authorities stopped endorsing it as real. The doctrine reveals how human consciousness creates safe spaces for moral ambiguity when absolute systems prove psychologically intolerable, and how we normalize these invented zones until they feel as real and necessary as the rigid categories they were designed to soften. Metempsychosis, derived from the ancient Greek words meaning change of soul, represents one of humanity's oldest and most persistently fascinating theories about what happens to consciousness after death, suggesting that the soul of a deceased person is reborn into a new body, whether human or animal, in an endless cycle of transmigration that continues until some form of spiritual perfection or liberation is achieved. This concept emerged independently across numerous ancient civilizations, appearing prominently in early Indian philosophical traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, where it became known as samsara, the endless wheel of rebirth driven by the accumulated consequences of one's actions across lifetimes, a principle termed karma that purportedly determines the nature and status of each successive incarnation. The mechanism underlying metempsychosis operates on a fundamentally logical premise from the perspective of those who embrace it. If consciousness or soul is an immaterial essence that cannot be destroyed, merely transformed, then it must continue to exist after physical death, and lacking a destination or final resting place, it necessarily seeks new corporeal vessels through which to experience existence, with the moral quality of each new life serving as either reward or punishment for behaviors in previous incarnations. Pythagoras in ancient Greece advocated for the transmigration of souls, believing he himself had lived multiple previous lives, and this doctrine spread throughout Mediterranean philosophy, influencing Platonic thought and persisting even into early Christian communities before ecclesiastical authorities gradually marginalized it in favor of linear concepts of heaven and hell. What remains particularly striking about metempsychosis is its remarkable persistence across millennia and cultures, maintained not primarily through scientific evidence or logical demonstration, but rather through its profound psychological appeal to human intuitions about justice, continuity, and the apparent wastefulness of consciousness simply ceasing to exist. The theory offers elegant explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena: why certain individuals appear naturally gifted in specific domains, why some children display uncanny knowledge or phobias they could not have acquired in their current lifetime, why we sometimes encounter strangers yet feel an inexplicable familiarity, and why the world contains such apparent inequality in talent, circumstance, and fortune. Across cultures spanning from ancient China to West Africa, from Japan to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, there exists a profound and enduring practice that positions the deceased not as inhabitants of some distant celestial realm, but as active, present forces within the daily lives of their living descendants. Ancestor worship operates on the fundamental premise that death does not sever the bond between the living and the dead, but rather transforms it into something more ethereal, more powerful, and paradoxically more influential than it was during life itself. In these belief systems, ancestors are not passive memories or abstract spiritual concepts floating somewhere beyond the veil, but rather engaged participants in household affairs, community decisions, and personal destinies who retain the capacity to bless their descendants with prosperity, health, and good fortune, or conversely to afflict them with misfortune and suffering should they be neglected or disrespected. The practice typically involves elaborate rituals of offerings, which might include food, incense, flowers, or symbolic representations of material goods, along with prayers and spoken communications directed toward the deceased as if they were physically present in the room, listening intently to every word. The logic underlying this practice rests upon a particular understanding of the nature of consciousness and existence, one that views the essential aspects of a person, their personality, their love, their concern for family, their accumulated wisdom, as too substantial to simply vanish upon the moment of biological death. Instead, these qualities are understood to persist in a modified form, hovering near the places and people they inhabited and cherished, creating a kind of spiritual proximity that allows for ongoing relationship and mutual influence. What proves remarkable is not merely the widespread prevalence of this belief, but the sophisticated justifications that adherents develop to explain how and why they know their ancestors are present and attentive, ranging from sudden feelings of warmth or comfort during rituals, to interpretations of coincidental events as signs of ancestral intervention, to dreams in which deceased relatives appear to offer guidance. The practice persists today among millions of people worldwide, many of whom maintain these beliefs alongside modern scientific understanding, suggesting that ancestor worship satisfies psychological needs that materialism and naturalism alone cannot address. In many East Asian cultures, particularly throughout China, Taiwan, Vietnam, and among diaspora communities worldwide, there exists a widespread practice of burning specially printed paper money at funerals, temples, and during ancestor veneration ceremonies, a custom rooted in the belief that the deceased require currency in the afterlife to purchase goods, pay debts, and maintain their standard of living beyond death. These sheets of colorful paper, often adorned with images of traditional Chinese currency, portraits of deities, or elaborate denominations bearing astronomical figures like 10 million or 100 billion units, are meticulously arranged in bundles and set aflame in designated metal containers or braziers, with family members observing the ritual in solemn ceremony as the smoke rises toward heaven, theoretically carrying the monetary value directly to ancestors waiting in the spiritual realm. The practice stems from a fundamentally transactional view of the afterlife itself, one in which the universe operates on principles not entirely dissimilar to earthly commerce, where spirits possess needs, desires, and economic limitations that must be addressed through material offerings, creating a bridge between the living and deceased through the medium of ritualized destruction. Psychologically, this ritual serves multiple simultaneous functions within the grieving process. It provides concrete action during moments of profound helplessness, transforms abstract grief into purposeful ceremony, offers a framework for discussing the deceased's needs and character, and creates collective family participation in a shared belief system that affirms continued relationship beyond death rather than absolute severance. The logical mechanism underlying ghost money burning rests upon sympathetic magic principles, the ancient idea that symbolic or ritualistic actions performed with intention and sincerity can produce real effects in unseen dimensions, that burning paper representations of wealth transfers actual economic benefit across the veil between worlds, a notion that persists not because evidence supports it, but because the ritual fulfills deep psychological needs around mortality, connection, and the desire to believe that our love and provision for others transcends even death itself. In ancient Egyptian belief systems, which developed over thousands of years along the Nile River Valley, the human soul was not conceived as a singular, unified entity as many modern Western religions might suggest, but rather as a complex collection of distinct spiritual components, each with its own purpose, characteristics, and journey through the afterlife. And among the most significant of these components were two fundamental aspects known as the Ka and the Ba. Concepts that emerged from Egypt's earliest dynasties and persisted through the classical period. The Ka, pronounced with a short vowel sound, was understood to be something akin to a life force or spiritual double, an invisible twin of the physical body that was believed to come into existence at the moment of birth and remained connected to the flesh throughout the person's lifetime, serving as the animating principle that gave the body vitality and consciousness. And when a person died, the Egyptians understood that the Ka did not simply vanish or dissipate into nothingness, but rather continued to exist in a shadowy form, which is precisely why they went to such elaborate lengths to preserve the physical body through mummification, because they believed the Ka required an anchor point, a recognizable form to which it could return and from which it could draw sustenance and stability in the otherworldly realm. The Ba, by contrast, was conceived as something more closely resembling what modern people might call personality, character, or consciousness itself, a force that contained memories, knowledge, emotions, and the individual's unique essence. And unlike the Ka, which was largely bound to the body or its tomb, the Ba was believed to possess mobility and agency, capable of moving freely through the landscape of the afterlife, able to visit the living world, to transform itself into different creatures or beings, and to experience the various dimensions of existence that lay beyond the material plane. The psychological mechanism underlying this dual-aspect theory of the soul appears to have emerged from the Egyptian observation of human experience and the puzzles that death presented to conscious minds, for they recognized that a person possessed multiple distinct qualities and aspects. There was the physical form that decayed, there was the personality that seemed to persist in memory, there were the dreams and invisible parts of consciousness that operated according to different rules than the waking body. And rather than forcing these observations into a single metaphysical framework, the Egyptians created a system that could accommodate this multiplicity, a theology that acknowledged that consciousness itself might be plural rather than singular. In ancient Greek mythology, the Asphodel Meadows represented a peculiar middle ground in the afterlife, a vast and seemingly endless field of pale flowers where the ordinary dead, neither particularly virtuous nor especially wicked, would spend eternity in a state of emotional numbness and spiritual indifference. According to Homer's descriptions in the Odyssey and other classical sources, these meadows stretched across the underworld as the default destination for the majority of souls, a place where the dead wandered without purpose, without passion, and without any meaningful engagement with their surroundings or each other, existing in what might be described as a permanent state of melancholic detachment. The Asphodel Meadows were not meant to be hellish in the sense of active torment or suffering, nor were they heavenly in the way that Elysium promised eternal joy and noble companionship, but rather something far more unsettling to the ancient imagination, complete and utter mediocrity, an eternity of absolute ordinariness where nothing mattered, nothing changed, and consciousness persisted only as a hollow echo of what it had been in life. The psychological mechanism underlying this particular vision of the afterlife appears rooted in the ancient Greek preoccupation with meaning and excellence, their cultural belief that human existence derived its worth from extraordinary achievement, passionate engagement, and the pursuit of glory. By constructing the Asphodel Meadows as a realm of profound meaninglessness, ancient Greek thinkers were essentially constructing a nightmarish punishment that would resonate deeply with their value system, suggesting that a life lived without distinction, without struggle, and without purpose would naturally result in an afterlife of corresponding emptiness. This concept emerged from a civilization that celebrated heroic deeds, intellectual achievement, and passionate commitment to ideals, making the prospect of eternal mediocrity seem worse than any conventional torment could be. What remains striking about the Asphodel Meadows is how remarkably this ancient anxiety persists in contemporary consciousness, though we rarely frame it in such explicitly mythological terms, for modern existential dread similarly concerns itself with the fear of meaninglessness, of living a forgotten life, of contributing nothing to the world, and of existing without significance or purpose, suggesting that this fundamental human fear of purposeless existence transcends both cultural boundaries and historical epochs, remaining encoded somewhere deep within how we understand the value of consciousness itself. In many East Asian cultures, particularly throughout China, Vietnam, and other regions influenced by Buddhist and Taoist traditions, there exists an annual observance known as the Ghost Festival, a multi-day celebration that typically occurs during the 7th lunar month and is built entirely upon the premise that the boundaries between the living world and the realm of the deceased become permeable during this specific time. The festival operates under a comprehensive belief system, suggesting that during these designated days, the spirits of the dead, particularly those who have no living descendants or who died without proper burial rites, are temporarily released from the underworld and allowed to wander freely among the living, requiring appeasement through elaborate rituals, offerings of food, incense, and paper money. Along with theatrical performances and communal gatherings designed specifically to entertain and satisfy these wandering souls. The festival involves the preparation of vast quantities of special foods, the construction of temporary altars in homes and public spaces, the burning of elaborate paper effigies representing everything from houses to automobiles and servants that participants believe will be transferred to the spirit world, and the organization of grand theatrical performances where actors perform classical stories and operas under the assumption that both living and deceased audience members are watching simultaneously. The psychological mechanism underlying this tradition appears rooted in several interconnected human needs. The desire to maintain social bonds with deceased family members despite their physical absence, the projection of guilt or responsibility onto a structured, ritualized format that transforms abstract anxiety about death into concrete, manageable actions, and the creation of a cosmological framework that renders the incomprehensible reality of mortality into something systematic and interactive. The festival effectively transforms the existential dread surrounding death and the afterlife into a prescribed social performance where participants can feel they are maintaining relationships, fulfilling obligations, and exerting some form of influence over supernatural forces, thereby reducing the helplessness that typically accompanies human mortality. Across virtually every human culture and religious tradition, there exists a peculiar figure whose role is to guide the souls of the dead from the land of the living into whatever realm or state awaits them beyond, and these beings are known as psychopomps, from the ancient Greek words for soul and guide, a concept so deeply embedded in human consciousness that it appears independently in traditions separated by thousands of miles and centuries of isolation. In ancient Egypt, the jackal-headed god Anubis served this function, leading souls through the underworld and weighing their hearts against the feather of truth, while in Greek mythology, Hermes or Charon the ferryman transported the deceased across the river Styx, and in Norse tradition, the Valkyries selected the honored dead to carry them to Valhalla, and in Mesoamerican cultures, the underworld guides accompanied souls through treacherous supernatural landscapes, and in Christianity, angels perform this sacred duty, and in Islam, Azrael is the angel of death who gently extracts the soul, and in many African and indigenous traditions, ancestor spirits or specific deities assume this role, suggesting that the human mind has a deep need to imagine that death is not an abandonment, but a guided transition. The psychological mechanism underlying this universal belief appears to stem from several converging human needs. First, the profound anxiety that death represents to our conscious minds creates a desire for order and structure in something that seems fundamentally chaotic and frightening, and the image of a guide transforms death from an abrupt void into a process with direction and purpose. Second, our social nature means we struggle with the concept of absolute solitude, so imagining that the dead are not alone but accompanied by a compassionate figure provides comfort to both the dying and those left behind. And third, throughout human life, we rely on guides and leaders to navigate unfamiliar territory, and it seems natural to extend this pattern even to the ultimate unknown journey. In Norse mythology, the Bifröst stands as one of the most vividly imagined pathways between worlds, a shimmering rainbow bridge that connects Midgard, the realm of humans, to Asgard, the home of the gods, and it represents a distinctly different conception of the afterlife journey than most Western traditions offer, one where passage is not instantaneous or spiritual in nature, but rather requires traversal across an actual physical structure that can be perceived and traveled upon. The bridge itself is described in the Eddic texts as impossibly beautiful, constructed from fire, water, and air in perfect balance, guarded by the god Heimdall who sits eternally at its entrance evaluating each soul that approaches, determining through some ineffable judgment whether they possess the worth required to cross into the divine realm and achieve a form of blessed existence among the pantheon. The psychological appeal of this concept lies in its fundamentally spatial understanding of transcendence, the human mind's deep need to conceptualize movement through barriers as the mechanism by which one transitions between states of being, and throughout countless cultures and time periods, This impulse manifests repeatedly in imagery of bridges, gates, rivers, and roads that must be crossed to reach blessed destinations. What makes the Bifröst particularly fascinating is how it combines the concrete with the numinous, the need for a physical explanation of spiritual transition with the acknowledgement that such a bridge must operate according to laws beyond ordinary comprehension. And this hybrid approach may resonate with how our brains are fundamentally wired to understand transformation through the metaphor of literal movement through space. The Bifröst persists in cultural consciousness not merely as ancient superstition, but as a profound poetic expression of how humans intuitively understand change and transcendence. And despite our modern scientific understanding of consciousness and the absence of any physical evidence for such pathways, we continue to employ the exact same metaphorical language when describing spiritual journeys, personal transformations, and the passage from life to whatever comes after. Suggesting that this particular framework for understanding the afterlife operates at such a deep level of human cognition that it remains resistant to erasure even as we gain knowledge that should render it obsolete. In Norse mythology, the concept of Ragnarök represents not an ending but a cyclical return, a catastrophic destruction followed by cosmic renewal, and this framework has persisted through centuries as a template for understanding how civilizations and even consciousness itself might transcend annihilation. The ancient Norse people envisioned a final battle where the gods would clash with giants, the world would sink into the sea, the sun would blacken, stars would vanish from the sky, and the earth would rise again from the waters fertile and green, with new gods walking among new humans in a reborn world, suggesting that death and destruction were not permanent states, but merely transitions within an eternal cycle of becoming. This notion has captivated modern minds precisely because it offers something that monotheistic afterlife theories cannot provide, namely a built-in mechanism for renewal that applies not only to individual souls, but to existence itself, implying that even our most catastrophic failures and civilizational collapses might serve as necessary preconditions for something better to emerge from the ruins. The psychological appeal of Ragnarök Rebirth operates through a profound human need to perceive meaning in suffering and destruction, allowing us to reframe apocalypse not as punishment or meaningless annihilation, but as essential creative destruction, a cosmic housecleaning that permits new growth and prevents eternal stagnation. When we examine why this theory persists despite having no empirical evidence and contradicting our ordinary experience of time as linear rather than cyclical, we find that it satisfies simultaneously the fatalistic pessimism that recognizes systemic collapse as inevitable, and the optimistic hope that transcendence awaits on the other side of that collapse, creating a psychological sweet spot where despair and hope coexist. Modern climate anxieties, economic uncertainties, and social upheaval have only strengthened Ragnarök Rebirth's grip on contemporary imagination, as the theory suggests that our current world's ending is not a tragedy but a prerequisite, that the systems we see crumbling must crumble completely so that something truer and more authentic can be born in their place. And this narrative has become deeply woven into contemporary spirituality, apocalyptic fiction, and even progressive political movements that envision radical systemic transformation as necessary death before resurrection. Yet this seductive framework carries a hidden danger. By romanticizing collapse as necessary prelude to renewal, we risk abdicating present responsibility for prevention and mitigation, unconsciously surrendering to destruction under the guise of enlightened acceptance, transforming passivity into philosophy. Among the indigenous peoples of North America, particularly throughout the Great Plains and Eastern Woodlands regions, there existed a widespread and deeply cherished conception of the afterlife known as the happy hunting ground, a paradise realm where the souls of hunters and warriors would continue their pursuits in perpetual abundance and perfect conditions. This otherworldly domain was imagined as an endless expanse of pristine forests and rolling prairies teeming with game animals that never grew scarce, where the hunting was eternally successful, the weather always favorable, and the spiritual essence of fallen prey offered itself willingly to the hunter's skill and honor. The concept served as a profound counterpoint to the hardships and uncertainties of earthly existence, where hunting seasons were unpredictable, harvests could fail catastrophically, and survival itself remained perpetually contingent upon luck, weather, and the availability of game that was often scarce and difficult to secure. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system operated on several interconnected levels. It provided existential comfort by transforming the most fundamental anxieties about death and resource scarcity into a narrative of eternal reward for those who embodied the virtues most essential to survival in their cultural context, namely courage, skill, and dedication to providing for one's community. Furthermore, the happy hunting ground reinforced the profound spiritual relationship these cultures maintained with the natural world and the animals upon which they depended, suggesting that the boundary between life and death was permeable, and that one's efforts in the mortal realm would be honored and continued in a refined and perfected form beyond death's threshold. What remains striking about the persistence of this concept throughout centuries of dramatic cultural transformation is how it endured not merely as folk belief, but as a structuring principle for understanding mortality itself, continuing to appear in literature, spiritual practices, and cultural memory long after the material conditions that produced it had fundamentally transformed, suggesting that certain afterlife concepts acquire a kind of cultural permanence that transcends the specific circumstances of their origin. The invocation of the happy hunting ground in contemporary Native American spirituality and in the broader American cultural imagination, from 19th-century literary romanticism to modern powwows and memorial practices, testifies to its resilience as a symbol of cultural continuity and resistance, a way of asserting that indigenous worldviews and values persist even as the conditions of indigenous life have been violently disrupted and transformed. In the Buddhist traditions that flourished throughout East Asia, particularly in China, Japan, and Vietnam, there emerged a concept of paradise so appealing, so geometrically perfect and emotionally accessible, that it became perhaps the most widely practiced form of Buddhism among ordinary people rather than monks and scholars. This is the Pure Land, a realm said to exist in the western reaches of the universe, presided over by a Buddha named Amitabha, whose name translates to infinite light. The Pure Land is described not as an abstract state of enlightenment achieved through rigorous meditation and philosophical understanding, but rather as an actual place, a genuine destination, where the faithful could be reborn after death into circumstances so ideal that enlightenment became almost inevitable. The mechanics of entry were remarkably simple compared to other spiritual paths. One needed only to hold sincere faith in Amitabha Buddha and recite his name with devotion, repeating the phrase Namo Amitabha Buddha with genuine intent, and at the moment of death, Amitabha himself would appear in a luminous procession to escort the believer to his celestial kingdom. Once there, the soul would find themselves in a landscape of extraordinary beauty, with wish-fulfilling trees, lotus ponds of jeweled water, palaces constructed from precious materials, and the constant presence of Amitabha's teachings filling the air, making spiritual progress toward enlightenment not a desperate struggle against human weakness, but a natural consequence of existing in such perfected surroundings. The psychological appeal of this theory lies in its profound accessibility and its compassionate acknowledgement of human limitation. Whereas other Buddhist paths demanded intense discipline, philosophical sophistication, and often multiple lifetimes of practice, the Pure Land offered salvation through faith alone, suggesting that devotion and sincerity mattered more than intellectual achievement or ascetic endurance. This framework provided comfort to the dying, to the suffering, to those who felt inadequate to the demanding philosophical frameworks of traditional Buddhism, and it spread so successfully that it eventually became the dominant form of Buddhism in East Asia, practiced by hundreds of millions of people who found in it both spiritual hope and emotional solace. In Japanese Buddhist tradition, Jigoku represents one of the most elaborate and systematized visions of hellish punishment ever conceived, a realm so intricately detailed that it rivals Dante's Inferno in its specificity and emotional weight. And what makes this particular afterlife theory so fascinating is not merely its existence, but the way it has persisted across centuries of Japanese spiritual life. Woven so deeply into the cultural consciousness that even modern Japanese speakers invoke its imagery in casual conversation and entertainment. Jigoku is depicted as a vast underground realm divided into multiple levels, with the deepest and most terrible being the Great Hell, where the most severe offenders experience punishments that are almost incomprehensibly cruel and tailored precisely to match the nature of each individual's transgressions during life. And these punishments are not merely physical, but existentially designed to create maximum psychological torment alongside bodily suffering. The 8 hot hells feature beings boiling in pots, being crushed under mountains, experiencing their skin flayed away by demons with sadistic precision, and enduring temperatures so extreme that they exist beyond normal comprehension, while the 8 cold hells present alternate forms of torment where beings freeze in pools of ice so cold that their skin cracks and blades. And this elaborate system of graduated suffering reveals something profound about human nature and our need to create cosmic justice systems. What makes Jigoku psychologically compelling is that it operates on a principle of karmic cause and effect, where your afterlife experience is not determined by a judge's whim, but rather flows inevitably from your own actions. And this creates a sense of moral order in the universe that proves deeply comforting even while being horrifying, because it suggests that suffering is never random, but always meaningful and deserved. And perhaps we find comfort in the idea that chaos has been replaced with an exquisitely just system where everyone receives exactly what they earned through their moral choices. In Japanese Buddhist and folkloric traditions, there exists a concept known as Meido, which translates roughly to the realm of the dead or the underworld, representing a liminal space between the earthly realm and ultimate salvation or damnation. Unlike the more clearly stratified afterlife systems found in many other religious traditions, Meido functions as something of a way station, a place where the spirits of the deceased undergo a period of transition and judgment before their ultimate destination is determined, whether that be rebirth into another form of existence, ascension to a Buddhist paradise, or descent into various forms of suffering. The actual geography and appearance of Meido varies considerably across different historical records and regional interpretations, though it is frequently described as a murky, shadowy landscape that exists parallel to the living world, accessible through rivers, mountains, or simply by crossing an invisible boundary that separates the two realms. What makes Meido particularly fascinating from a conceptual standpoint is how it emerged as a synthesis of indigenous Japanese spiritual beliefs and imported Buddhist theology, creating a distinctly hybrid system that neither wholly belongs to one tradition nor the other, yet somehow feels internally coherent within the Japanese religious imagination. The mechanism by which Meido persists in the cultural consciousness appears rooted in its flexibility and its capacity to address existential anxieties that more rigid afterlife systems might struggle to accommodate, particularly the anxiety surrounding judgment and the indeterminacy of one's ultimate fate. By proposing a realm where souls exist in a state of potential rather than immediate finality, the concept of Meido allows for the possibility of intervention, prayer, and continued spiritual work by the living on behalf of the deceased, thereby maintaining social bonds across the boundary between life and death in a way that feels personally meaningful to practitioners. Despite the secularization of modern Japan and the waning influence of traditional religious frameworks in everyday life, Meido persists not merely as a relic of folk belief, but as a deeply embedded cultural metaphor that continues to shape how Japanese people conceptualize transition, uncertainty, and the relationship between past and present, demonstrating how even theories of the afterlife that lack empirical foundation can maintain cultural vitality through their psychological and social utility rather than through literal belief. Transmigration, also known as the transmigration of souls, represents one of humanity's oldest and most widespread beliefs about what happens to consciousness after death, suggesting that the soul or essence of a person does not simply vanish or ascend to a fixed heavenly realm, but rather continues its existence by entering into a new body, whether human or animal, beginning an entirely fresh life with no memory of its previous incarnation. This concept emerged independently across numerous cultures and civilizations spanning thousands of years, appearing prominently in Hindu philosophy, where it forms the foundation of the caste system, in Buddhist teachings, where it becomes bound to the wheel of samsara through cycles of suffering and rebirth, in ancient Greek mystery religions, where thinkers like Pythagoras and Plato contemplated the soul's journey through multiple bodies, and even in early Jewish and Christian traditions, before becoming largely systematized out of mainstream Western theology. The psychological mechanism underlying transmigration's enduring appeal lies in humanity's profound discomfort with absolute finality and the existential terror induced by contemplating total non-existence. The theory offers a paradoxical comfort by suggesting that while the conscious self may not remember or recognize its past lives, some essential aspect of identity persists and continues forward, creating a bridge across what would otherwise be an unbridgeable chasm of oblivion. Furthermore, transmigration elegantly attempts to resolve the problem of inequality and suffering in the world by proposing that one's current circumstances, whether fortunate or desperate, represent karmic consequences earned through actions in previous lifetimes, thereby absolving divine beings or the universe itself of responsibility for seemingly random injustice, while simultaneously providing a mechanism through which suffering becomes meaningful and purposeful rather than meaningless. What proves most remarkable about transmigration's persistence, despite the absence of any empirical evidence or scientific mechanism that could plausibly explain how consciousness could transfer between bodies, is that billions of people have embraced it as literal truth for millennia, finding it more psychologically acceptable than the alternative of complete annihilation. And even in modern secular societies, where transmigration has lost much of its institutional religious scaffolding, reincarnation beliefs have resurged through popular culture, regression therapy movements, and New Age spirituality, demonstrating that the human mind continues seeking continuity of consciousness beyond death regardless of whether contemporary neuroscience or philosophy can justify such hopes. In Jewish mysticism, and particularly within the Kabbalistic tradition, there exists a concept known as Gilgul Neshamot, often translated simply as Gilgul, which describes the transmigration of souls across multiple lifetimes and incarnations, a belief system that has persisted for centuries within certain Jewish communities and continues to influence contemporary spiritual practice and understanding of existence. Unlike the more familiar Eastern concepts of reincarnation found in Hinduism and Buddhism, Gilgul operates within a distinctly Jewish theological framework where souls are understood to return to the physical world not as a consequence of karmic debt or cosmic cycles, but rather as a purposeful mechanism for spiritual rectification, growth, and the completion of unfinished divine work that a soul failed to accomplish during its previous embodiments on earth. The doctrine emerged prominently during medieval times, gaining substantial philosophical and religious weight through the writings of 16th-century Jewish mystics in Safed, particularly through the teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, whose elaboration of transmigration theory became foundational to Lurianic Kabbalah and subsequently influenced Jewish thought for generations to follow. According to this framework, a soul might return multiple times, potentially inhabiting different bodies across centuries, each time given fresh opportunities to fulfill specific spiritual missions, repair moral failures, rectify ethical shortcomings, or complete sacred obligations that remained undone in previous lives, suggesting that suffering, hardship, and personal struggle in one's current existence might actually represent karmic consequences or spiritual assignments from distant past incarnations. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief appears rooted in humanity's profound need to find meaning and purpose in seemingly random suffering, in unexplained talent or propensity, in inexplicable emotional connections, and in the universal human experience of feeling that one's current life contains depths and complexities that cannot be fully explained by genetics, environment, or circumstance alone. Remarkably, despite the complete absence of empirical evidence supporting transmigration, despite the lack of scientific mechanisms through which consciousness could transfer between bodies, and despite modern neuroscience demonstrating that memory and consciousness are fundamentally dependent on physical brain structure, Gilgul remains woven into the spiritual fabric of contemporary Jewish life, with many adherents interpreting their life challenges, talents, relationships, and callings as echoes of previous soul journeys, effectively normalizing a metaphysical concept as an interpretive lens through which to understand their present existence. In Jewish theological tradition, there exists a concept known as Olam Ha-Ba, which translates from Hebrew as the world to come, representing an intricate and remarkably multifaceted vision of the afterlife that has evolved across centuries of rabbinical interpretation and philosophical debate. Unlike the more concrete and visually definable heavens and hells found in Christian or Islamic theology, Olam Ha-Ba emerged as an extraordinarily abstract notion, one that resists singular definition and instead encompasses multiple possible interpretations simultaneously, ranging from a physical resurrection of the body in a messianic age to a purely spiritual existence of the soul in a realm beyond material comprehension. The concept appears sporadically throughout the Mishnah and Talmud, yet never with the kind of systematic clarity that would allow believers to construct a unified understanding of what exactly awaits them after death, creating instead a deliberately ambiguous framework that permits theological flexibility across different Jewish communities and historical periods. What makes Olam Ha-Ba psychologically compelling is precisely this ambiguity. For human consciousness gravitates naturally toward frameworks that provide comfort without demanding rigid literal acceptance, allowing adherents to maintain intellectual honesty while simultaneously holding on to hope for cosmic justice and personal continuity beyond mortality. The concept functions less as a detailed map of the afterlife and more as a placeholder for the unknowable, a linguistic and philosophical container into which people pour their deepest yearnings for meaning, redemption, and the assurance that their suffering in this world might be balanced by reward in the next. The remarkable persistence of Olam Ha-Ba across Jewish history, surviving centuries of scientific advancement and philosophical sophistication, demonstrates how religious traditions endure not through empirical claims, but through their capacity to remain deliberately vague enough to accommodate doubt, reinterpretation, and evolution with each successive generation of believers. This capacity for reinterpretation becomes especially evident in how different Jewish movements, from Orthodox to Reform to Reconstructionist, have each reimagined Olam Ha-Ba to align with their contemporary understanding of Jewish identity and purpose, transforming what might seem like a static theological doctrine into a living, breathing concept that continues to address the existential questions that animate human longing across generations. In medieval Christian theology and early Jewish mysticism, there emerged a peculiar conception of the intermediate afterlife known as the Bosom of Abraham, a shadowy realm that occupied an unusual position between death and final judgment, where the righteous souls of the Old Testament era would rest in comfort and safety while awaiting the resurrection of Christ and the ultimate transformation of existence itself. This concept derived primarily from the parable of Lazarus and the rich man found in the Gospel of Luke, describes a place of comfort and peace where Abraham himself would receive the faithful departed into his embrace, a physical yet spiritual location that existed in a state of suspended animation, neither heaven nor hell but something altogether different, a waiting room for eternity where the patriarchs and prophets would dwell in tranquility. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief system operated on the fundamental human need to reconcile the justice of God with the apparent unfairness of death, particularly the deaths of righteous people who lived before Christ's crucifixion and therefore could not have directly benefited from Christian redemption, creating a logical problem that demanded a theological solution. And thus the bosom of Abraham served as a comforting intermediary space that acknowledged both the sanctity of Old Testament figures and the exclusivity of Christian salvation. This concept persists in various forms throughout Christian tradition, from Catholic theology, where it relates to the doctrine of limbo, to Orthodox Christianity, where it becomes part of a more nuanced understanding of the afterlife, demonstrating how religious systems continuously adapt and reinterpret ancient ideas to address contemporary spiritual questions. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly this imaginary space has been integrated into theological discourse, discussed with the same certainty as if it were an empirically observable location, taught in seminaries and religious schools as part of legitimate religious studies, illustrating humanity's persistent capacity to elaborate upon metaphorical language until it becomes accepted doctrine, transforming a single parable into an entire geography of the unseen world that continues to influence how billions of people understand death, salvation, and the nature of divine justice across the centuries. Within Islamic theology and Arabian folklore, there exists a concept of the Djinn Realm, a parallel dimension inhabited by beings of smokeless fire who exist between the material world and the divine. And according to many traditional interpretations, this realm becomes the destination for certain souls after death, particularly those who have made pacts with these supernatural entities or who have lived lives so steeped in transgression that they cannot ascend to paradise nor descend fully into hell, but instead drift in an eternal liminal space where they serve the jinn or are tormented by them in ways that defy the conventional hierarchies of the Islamic afterlife. This belief system arose from centuries of interaction between pre-Islamic Arabian spiritualism and the monotheistic framework of Islam, creating a hybrid understanding where jinn are acknowledged as real creatures mentioned in the Quran itself. Yet their realm remains mysterious, shadowy, and fundamentally beyond human comprehension or observation. The psychological mechanism that sustains belief in the Djinn realm operates through the same fundamental human need to explain the unexplainable that has driven afterlife theories since ancient times. but it also functions as a way to process the reality of human behavior that seems to exist outside moral categories. Those individuals who commit acts so heinous or inexplicable that they cannot be easily reconciled with conventional morality. And thus the Djinn Realm provides a narrative container for such souls, a place where cosmic justice can still be served even when earthly justice fails or seems inadequate. What makes the Djinn Realm particularly fascinating as a persistent belief is how it has survived centuries of rational examination and scientific advancement by remaining deliberately vague and unapproachable, never making claims that can be definitively tested or refuted, always keeping itself just beyond the reach of human knowledge, and this very inscrutability has paradoxically strengthened its cultural persistence, allowing it to adapt to new contexts and new understandings of human psychology without ever needing to substantively change its core narrative. In contemporary times, this adaptability has allowed the Djinn Realm to absorb modern anxieties. Individuals experiencing mental illness, addiction, or sudden personality changes are sometimes still interpreted through this framework, with the realm serving as a metaphorical space where cultural trauma and psychological suffering can be articulated when biomedical explanations feel insufficient or culturally foreign. In Hindu and Sanskrit cosmology, Svarga represents a celestial realm of considerable complexity and appeal, a place of extraordinary sensory pleasure and extended life that exists as an intermediate paradise between the earthly plane and the ultimate liberation of moksha. And according to classical Hindu texts like the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the great epics such as the Mahabharata and Ramayana, this realm is populated by gods, celestial beings. And those virtuous humans, whose karma has earned them temporary residence in this exalted dimension where time operates differently and suffering is virtually non-existent. The mechanics of achieving Svarga operate through a sophisticated karmic accounting system wherein one's actions during life accumulate merit or demerit, and those who perform their dharmic duties, engage in ritual worship, practice austerities, and live ethically gradually accumulate sufficient merit to ascend to Svarga upon death, while those with insufficient merit might be reborn into lower forms to continue their spiritual development. What makes Svarga particularly intriguing from a psychological perspective is how it functions as a middle path between immediate gratification and ultimate transcendence, offering a reward system that is neither as simple as the eternal heaven of monotheistic religions nor as demanding as the complete annihilation of the self that moksha requires. And this structure allows the philosophy to accommodate different spiritual capacities among individuals while maintaining a coherent worldview about moral causality and personal progress. The persistent appeal of Svarga, despite the absence of empirical evidence or logical proof, suggests that humans universally seek to reconcile the apparent injustices of earthly existence with some form of moral order, and the idea that suffering is never meaningless, but rather contributes to eventual transcendence through karma, provides psychological comfort and narrative coherence to random misfortune and pain. Even in our modern secular age, the underlying structure of Svarga continues to influence how millions of people conceptualize justice, reward, and the purpose of ethical behavior, demonstrating how deeply embedded such metaphysical frameworks have become in human consciousness. The concept has also permeated secular ethical systems, from the meritocratic promise that hard work yields success to the modern notion of building heaven on earth through social progress, revealing how the archetypal structure of Svarga, effort leading to reward leading to transcendence, remains the dominant narrative by which humanity organizes its understanding of meaning and consequence. Within the vast spiritual framework of Hinduism and related Indian philosophical traditions stretches a detailed conception of the afterlife realm known as Pitru Loka, a dimension that exists as a way station for the souls of deceased ancestors who have not yet achieved final liberation or moksha from the cycle of reincarnation. According to these teachings, when a person dies, their subtle body, composed of mind and intellect rather than physical matter, travels to this intermediate realm where it dwells in a state that reflects the karmic residue of their earthly life, neither experiencing the torments of lower realms nor the transcendent bliss of higher celestial planes. Pitru Loka is understood to be populated by the Pitrus, ancestral spirits who maintain a continued existence in this dimension. And from this realm, these ancestors are believed to exert subtle influences upon the living members of their families, capable of blessing their descendants with prosperity and progeny if appropriately honored and remembered through specific rituals and ceremonies. The mechanism underlying this belief system rests upon the foundational Hindu understanding that consciousness persists beyond physical death, that actions generate consequences spanning multiple lifetimes, and that the living possess both the duty and the power to assist their ancestors through offerings called Shraddh, which consist of food, water, and prayer performed on anniversaries of death or during designated periods like Pitru Paksha, the fortnight devoted to honoring the deceased. This concept provides a structured framework for grief and loss by transforming death from an absolute ending into a temporary separation that can be bridged through proper ritual observance, thereby granting families a sense of continued relationship with their deceased and a meaningful role in their spiritual progression toward eventual liberation. The persistence of Pitru Loka beliefs across thousands of years and among hundreds of millions of people demonstrates humanity's universal resistance to accepting death as absolute finality, revealing how deeply we normalize the idea that consciousness somehow continues beyond the grave when given the proper cultural, religious, and philosophical scaffolding to make such continuation seem logical, necessary, and empirically observable through the metaphorical language of spiritual experience and communal tradition. Deep within certain strands of ancient cosmological philosophy and mystical traditions, particularly those emerging from Hindu, Taoist, and pre-Socratic Greek thought, there exists a peculiar conception of the afterlife that imagines the entire universe itself as a vast cosmic egg. And within this framework, the human soul upon death does not ascend to some distant heaven nor descend into a subterranean hell, but rather undergoes a process of dissolution and reabsorption back into the primordial cosmic substance from which all consciousness originates, only to be remixed and reconfigured within the next universal cycle as the existing cosmic egg eventually cracks open and gives birth to a fresh creation, thereby allowing the individual consciousness to be reborn not merely as another person in the same world, but as a potentially different form of existence within an entirely new cosmos that arises from the remnants and spiritual essence of the previous one. This theory rests upon the logical mechanism that if the universe itself is conceived as a conscious, self-contained entity with its own life cycle of expansion and contraction, birth and death, then individual human consciousness would logically be understood as merely temporary expressions or fractal iterations of that greater universal consciousness, making death not an ending, but a return to the source where the boundaries between self and cosmos dissolve completely, and one becomes indistinguishable from the infinite whole until the moment of rebirth arrives. The psychological appeal of this framework operates on several profound levels. It offers both comfort through the promise of eternal recurrence and cosmic significance by suggesting that one's death genuinely matters to the universe, because it contributes essential material and spiritual substance back into the great wheel of cosmic renewal, transforming what would otherwise be personal annihilation into a meaningful recycling that sustains the endless dance of creation and dissolution across eternity. What persists about this theory, despite its ethereal and scientifically unsupported nature, is precisely its scale and sublimity. For by situating human mortality within a vast cosmic drama rather than treating death as mere biological cessation, it invites the mind to contemplate mysteries that transcend our ordinary experience and speaks to a deep human yearning to understand whether our consciousness might somehow persist in forms that we lack the current framework to comprehend or imagine. The concept of the astral plane represents one of the most enduring and widespread beliefs in human metaphysics, appearing across countless cultures, spiritual traditions, and contemporary esoteric movements with remarkable consistency, despite the complete absence of any measurable or verifiable evidence for its existence. According to proponents of this theory, the astral plane is understood to be a non-physical dimension of reality that exists parallel to our material world, inhabited by spirits, entities, and the consciousness or soul of living human beings who have learned to project themselves beyond their physical bodies through meditation, sleep, or deliberate out-of-body experiences. Practitioners claim that through various techniques, one can separate their consciousness or astral body from their physical form and travel consciously through this alternate realm, encountering deceased individuals, spiritual guides, divine beings, or even visiting distant physical locations while their body remains asleep or in a trance state. The astral plane is frequently described as being layered into multiple levels or frequencies, with lower levels thought to correspond to earthly concerns and negative emotions, while higher levels are said to be more refined, peaceful, and spiritually advanced realms inhabited by enlightened beings and guides. The psychological mechanism underlying these experiences likely stems from the well-documented phenomenon of sleep paralysis combined with lucid dreaming, wherein a person's consciousness becomes partially aware during the rapid eye movement stage of sleep, while their voluntary muscles remain temporarily immobilized, creating a profoundly disorienting state that the brain naturally interprets as a separation of mind from body. The vividness and internal consistency of these experiences, coupled with their emotional intensity and the person's genuine sense of having traveled somewhere real, creates a compelling subjective certainty that feels indistinguishable from actual perception, thus reinforcing the belief that something tangible has occurred. What remains peculiar about the persistence of astral plane beliefs is that despite centuries of investigation and countless anecdotal reports, no astral traveler has ever returned with verifiable information that could not have been obtained through ordinary means, nor has any experiment managed to produce reproducible proof of consciousness existing or traveling independently of the physical brain. In the late 19th century, as spiritualism swept through the Western world with unprecedented fervor, a peculiar vision of the afterlife emerged from seance rooms and spirit communication circles, one that depicted the realm beyond death not as a distant, abstract heaven or hell, but as a tangible place called Summerland. Conceived as an earthly paradise frozen in eternal springtime, where departed souls would reunite with loved ones and continue their pursuits in an idealized version of earthly life. The concept originated primarily within spiritualist circles, particularly among mediums and spiritualist authors who claimed to receive detailed descriptions of this realm through direct communication with the dead, and these accounts were remarkably consistent across different practitioners and continents, describing gardens of impossible beauty, architecture of crystalline perfection, libraries containing all knowledge, and communities where the departed would be reunited with family members who had passed before them, all existing in a state of perpetual joy and spiritual advancement. The psychological appeal of Summerland rested upon its profound accessibility and familiarity. Unlike traditional Christian heaven with its abstract communion with the divine or Buddhist nirvana with its dissolution of the self, Summerland offered grieving individuals the comforting promise that death was merely a transition to a slightly improved version of earthly existence, where they could resume relationships, engage in meaningful work, and continue their personal development without suffering or limitation. The mechanism driving belief in Summerland appears rooted in the human tendency to process grief through the lens of what we already know, to imagine that the people we lose have not truly become alien to us, but have simply relocated to a place where we might one day join them, and the emerging technology of the era, particularly electricity and mechanized transportation, seem to validate the possibility of invisible realms existing just beyond our perception. Much as radio waves and electromagnetic forces were being discovered to operate beyond human sensory range. Across numerous indigenous cultures spanning continents and centuries, there exists a deeply embedded belief system that posits the existence of a parallel realm known as the spirit world, a dimension inhabited by ancestors, nature deities, animal spirits, and supernatural entities that coexist alongside our physical reality and maintain active relationships with the living. In many African, Native American, Asian, and Pacific Islander traditions, this spirit world is not viewed as a distant heaven or hell separated by death, but rather as an invisible layer of existence that permeates the same spaces we occupy, accessible through ritual, meditation, shamanic journeys, or moments of spiritual clarity where the boundaries between the material and immaterial become momentarily permeable. Practitioners describe encounters with ancestors who guide their descendants through dreams and visions, offer protection during dangerous undertakings, or communicate urgent warnings about impending dangers, creating a reciprocal relationship where the living maintain shrines, leave offerings of food and drink, perform ceremonies, and speak directly to their deceased relatives as though they were simply in another room rather than another dimension. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent belief appears rooted in humanity's fundamental difficulty accepting the finality of death and the human mind's remarkable capacity to interpret ambiguous sensory experiences as contact with otherworldly intelligences. When someone experiences the vivid emotional intensity of a dream featuring a deceased loved one, the brain's inability to distinguish between actual and imagined sensory input during sleep creates the phenomenological sensation of genuine contact, reinforcing the belief that consciousness continues beyond bodily death and remains capable of interaction. This framework also addresses the deep human need to maintain relationships with those we have lost, allowing grief to be transmuted into ongoing dialogue rather than permanent severance, thereby providing psychological comfort that transcends logical proof or material evidence. Across nearly every culture and continent, there exists a persistent belief that death does not represent a final departure from the physical world, but rather a confused transition into a liminal state where spirits become lost, disoriented, or trapped between dimensions, unable to find their way to their proper destination or resting place. In Japanese folklore, these entities are known as yurei, spirits of the deceased who have unfinished business, harboring deep regrets or unfulfilled desires that anchor them to the earthly realm, causing them to wander through the nights in distinctive white burial garments, their hair flowing unnaturally as they search for resolution or revenge. Similar concepts appear throughout Chinese traditions with hungry ghosts, in European ghost stories with spirits condemned to haunt specific locations, and in numerous indigenous belief systems where ancestors may become separated from the spiritual plane and wander in confusion. The mechanism underlying this theory seems to emerge from humanity's profound discomfort with the concept of absolute cessation, combined with our observation of unresolved human suffering and our intuitive sense that intense emotion and unfinished purpose should somehow persist beyond biological death. When we encounter stories of apparitions appearing at the moment of death to loved ones, or hear accounts of restless activity in locations where tragedy occurred, our minds naturally construct a narrative framework that accommodates both the reality of death and the seeming persistence of intention or distress, creating a psychologically satisfying explanation for coincidences, grief-induced hallucinations, and the inevitable mysteries that remain unsolved in human lives. This belief system has proven remarkably durable precisely because it addresses fundamental anxieties about abandonment and meaninglessness, offering instead a vision where even death cannot sever the bonds of love, regret, or unfinished business, where consciousness persists in some form even when the body has ceased to function, and where proper rituals, prayers, or investigation might finally grant these wandering spirits the peace or resolution they so desperately seek. This explains why cultures worldwide have developed elaborate systems of commemoration, from Day of the Dead altars laden with offerings, to Buddhist prayer ceremonies for the deceased, to Western traditions of grave maintenance, each representing a collective acknowledgement that honoring the dead and addressing their unresolved concerns remains a fundamental human responsibility, one that transcends the boundary between the living and the dead. Across cultures spanning continents and centuries, from East Asian households to African homes to Latin American shrines, people construct physical spaces dedicated entirely to the memory and veneration of those who have died, creating what we might call ancestor altars, and these remarkable installations exist as both deeply functional spiritual infrastructure and profound psychological monuments to the persistence of connection beyond death itself. These altars typically occupy a designated corner or wall within a home, carefully arranged with photographs of the deceased, sometimes showing them at various ages throughout their lives, alongside offerings that reflect what the departed person enjoyed in life, whether that meant food and drink, flowers, incense, candles, or small objects that held personal significance to the individual being remembered. In many Chinese households, ancestor altars represent an active, ongoing relationship with family members who have crossed into the afterlife, with the living regularly presenting food offerings, burning incense, and speaking directly to the photographic images as though the deceased person remains present and capable of hearing, blessing the household, and maintaining protective oversight of family affairs and important decisions. The psychological mechanism operating beneath these practices reveals something profound about how human consciousness manages grief and separation, as the physical space allows for a form of continued dialogue that transforms mourning from a process of abandonment into an extended relationship operating under different rules and different physics, where proximity becomes defined not by physical presence, but by intentional attention and ritualized remembrance. The brain, remarkably adaptive and desperate to maintain bonds, finds genuine psychological comfort in performing these repeated actions. In speaking to a photograph, in offering food to a memory, because these behaviors satisfy the human need for reciprocal relationship even as they acknowledge the fundamental truth of absence and irreversibility. Throughout the history of religious and spiritual thought, many traditions have grappled with the idea that death, as we understand it, might not be the final cessation of existence, but rather a transition point between states of being, and among these concepts exists the peculiar notion of a second death, a phenomenon that appears across numerous faith systems and philosophical frameworks as a kind of spiritual mortality that occurs after the physical body has already perished. The second death emerges most prominently in Christian theology, particularly within certain interpretations of the Book of Revelation, where it is described as the ultimate fate of those deemed unworthy of salvation, a death that is somehow more final and terrifying than the first because it represents the permanent separation of the soul from any hope of redemption or continuation, and this concept has persisted through centuries of theological debate and interpretation. The mechanism underlying this belief operates on a fundamental principle of duality that divides human existence into multiple layers of being, suggesting that just as the physical body can die while consciousness or soul persists, so too can the spiritual essence itself experience a kind of death, a permanent annihilation or exile that is conceived as worse than physical mortality because it forecloses all possibility of afterlife, resurrection, or any form of continued existence whatsoever. This idea reflects a deeply human need to establish consequences and moral weight to our choices, creating a framework in which death itself becomes not merely a universal fate but a judgment, where the quality of one's eternal existence depends entirely upon alignment with divine will or spiritual principle. What makes the concept of second death particularly persistent despite its logical difficulties is the way it allows religious systems to maintain both the promise of eternal life and the threat of ultimate punishment simultaneously, offering a solution to the theodicy problem by suggesting that divine justice operates across multiple stages of existence rather than being resolved entirely at the moment of physical death. And this both comforts believers with the possibility of transcendence, while frightening them with the threat of permanent spiritual oblivion. Among the most persistent and logically troubling afterlife theories in human history is the concept of bodily resurrection, the belief that after death, the physical body itself will be restored, reconstituted, and made whole again to house the soul or consciousness in a realm beyond this life. This doctrine has taken root across multiple religious traditions spanning millennia, from early Christian theology to Islamic eschatology to Jewish mystical thought, each adding its own particular details and mechanisms to explain how such a thing might actually occur. The theory proposes that death is not the final end of the physical form, but rather a temporary dissolution from which the body will eventually be awakened, reformed, and reunited with its spiritual essence, allowing the deceased to exist again in material form within paradise or the afterlife. Throughout history, believers have constructed elaborate theological frameworks attempting to reconcile this concept with observable reality, wrestling with profound questions about what happens to bodies that decompose, are cremated, scattered across oceans, or consumed by animals over centuries of time. Early Christian theologians devoted considerable intellectual effort to addressing these paradoxes, debating whether resurrection bodies would be identical to earthly bodies, whether they would retain scars or deformities, and how the same physical matter could possibly be gathered and reconstructed when atoms have dispersed irretrievably into the soil and atmosphere. The psychological appeal of bodily resurrection lies partly in humanity's deep discomfort with the idea of total annihilation and our instinctive attachment to physical identity and continuity, our sense that we are inextricably bound to our bodies in ways that make pure spiritual existence feel incomplete or unreal. It also reflects a fundamental human desire for wholeness and continuity across time, a resistance to the idea that consciousness might persist while the physical self entirely ceases to be, as though the body represents our truest and most essential self. Yet despite the logical impossibilities that modern science has rendered increasingly apparent, from the irreversible nature of decomposition to the conservation of mass and energy, bodily resurrection remains a sincere article of faith for billions of people across the world, deeply embedded in their spiritual worldviews and their understanding of death's ultimate meaning. What is remarkable is how thoroughly this concept has endured, how it has been woven so completely into the fabric of religious thought that questioning it often feels not like intellectual inquiry, but like spiritual transgression, a sign of insufficient faith rather than reasonable skepticism. Imagine a belief system where death is not an ending but rather a cosmic refund, where your soul does not ascend to heaven or descend to hell, but instead returns to the universe like a library book being returned to its shelf, ready to be checked out again by someone new. And this concept, known as soul recycling, represents one of the most persistent metaphysical theories about what happens to consciousness after the body ceases to function. The idea suggests that souls are finite resources within the universe, a limited number of spiritual entities that circulate through countless bodies across infinite generations, meaning that the person sitting next to you might literally be inhabited by a soul that once animated a pharaoh, a peasant, a saint, or a criminal, and that your own essence might have existed in dozens or hundreds of previous forms before arriving in your current body. This theory draws inspiration from reincarnation beliefs found in Buddhism, Hinduism, and various esoteric traditions, but extends the concept further by suggesting not just that rebirth happens, but that the total number of souls remains constant, that they are being recycled and distributed like matter in an ecosystem, with souls moving from one body to another in an endless cycle that has no beginning and presumably no end. The psychological appeal of soul recycling lies in its elegant answer to several fundamental anxieties simultaneously, addressing our fear of personal annihilation by suggesting we never truly die but merely change forms, while also providing a sense of cosmic balance and justice through the mechanism of karma, whereby a soul's experiences in one life determine its circumstances in the next, creating a moral universe where actions have inevitable consequences even across the barrier of death and forgotten memory. Furthermore, soul recycling offers comfort through the paradoxical notion of universal connection, suggesting that everyone who has ever lived shares in the same limited pool of consciousness, that we are all fundamentally recycled versions of the same spiritual substance, variations on eternal themes rather than unique creations. Yet despite the absence of any measurable evidence, despite the fact that consciousness cannot be weighed or detected or tracked across lifetimes, and despite our inability to explain how memories might be erased and then somehow recovered in different bodies, this theory persists across cultures and centuries, suggesting that humans are willing to accept metaphysical complexity and unfalsifiable claims if those claims provide sufficient emotional comfort and existential meaning. Revealing that our commitment to these afterlife theories often has more to do with what we need to believe than with what evidence might support. In ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian belief systems, there existed a compelling figure known as the Ferryman of Souls, a supernatural entity tasked with the solemn responsibility of transporting the deceased across a treacherous body of water that separated the land of the living from the realm of the dead. And this figure, most famously embodied by Charon in Greek mythology, demanded payment in the form of a coin placed upon the tongue or in the mouth of the deceased before burial could take place. The belief was so deeply ingrained in the cultures that practiced it that families would ensure the proper placement of these coins with utmost care, understanding that without this payment, the deceased would be condemned to wander the shores of the river Styx for 100 years, unable to cross into the afterlife and unable to find peace. This concept emerged from a fundamental human need to impose order and logical structure upon the chaotic and terrifying reality of death itself, transforming the unknowable abyss into a navigable journey with clear rules, payment systems, and defined destinations that could be understood and managed through proper ritual observance. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the transformation of existential dread into procedural certainty. By establishing that death requires a transaction and a journey, ancient peoples created a framework that made death feel less like an absolute end and more like a transition within a comprehensible system, something that could be prepared for and controlled through human action. What remains remarkable is how this belief persisted across multiple unrelated civilizations, suggesting that the human mind instinctively gravitates toward narratives that involve exchange and commerce even in matters of the soul, perhaps because economic transactions are among the most familiar and ritualized behaviors in human society. Even today, centuries after the abandonment of literal belief in Charon, the concept of the Ferryman lingers in cultural memory, in literature, in art, and in the metaphorical language we use to describe death and passage, suggesting that we have never truly escaped the comfort that such structured narratives provide, and that perhaps we still unconsciously seek payment systems and clear protocols for navigating the ultimate unknowable journey. In contemporary funeral practices, we see echoes of this ancient need in the ritualized handling of the body, the careful preparation of the deceased, and the ceremonial nature of passage itself, whether through wake, funeral service, or memorial gathering, all of which serve the same psychological function that Karen once provided, the transformation of loss into ritual and chaos into ceremony. Perhaps no figure in the history of human afterlife mythology has captured our collective imagination quite like the Grim Reaper, a skeletal specter draped in tattered black robes who arrives at the moment of death to escort souls away from the living world. This entity emerged most prominently during the medieval period, when plague, famine, and warfare decimated entire populations across Europe, and artists began depicting death as a dark, hooded figure wielding a scythe to harvest human lives as one might harvest wheat from a field. The image was so visceral, so immediately recognizable even to the illiterate masses, that it became embedded in the cultural consciousness and has persisted for nearly 1,000 years, appearing and reappearing in literature, art, film, and folklore with remarkable consistency across vastly different societies and time periods. What makes the Grim Reaper particularly fascinating is how it simultaneously represents both the randomness of mortality and a strange kind of order, as though death itself were not merely a biological process, but rather a purposeful collection by an actual entity, a being with agency and intention who personally comes for each of us when our time expires. This psychological mechanism likely emerged because humans have always struggled with the fundamental unpredictability of death, the way it strikes without warning or apparent reason, taking the young alongside the old, the righteous alongside the wicked, leaving survivors devastated and searching for meaning in seemingly meaningless loss. By personifying death as the Grim Reaper, our ancestors created a framework that paradoxically made death both more terrifying and more comprehensible, transforming an abstract biological failure into a tangible encounter with a personified force, someone or something that could theoretically be negotiated with, appeased, or even occasionally outwitted, as in the countless stories where clever individuals gamble with death or bargain for extensions on their lives. Despite our modern scientific understanding of death as a medical event involving systemic failure and cessation of neural activity, the image of the Grim Reaper has not faded, but instead been absorbed into contemporary culture as an aesthetic symbol, appearing in video games, popular music, and entertainment as casually as we might reference any other cultural icon, suggesting that on some deep level, the desire to personify death remains unchanged even as our rational minds insist we know better. In the folklore of Ireland and Scotland, the banshee represents one of the most persistent and haunting figures in the Western spiritual imagination, a female spirit whose mournful wail is said to herald the death of someone within a family of Irish or Scottish descent, and according to the traditional accounts passed down through generations, these ethereal beings are bound to particular family lineages, appearing most often to warn of imminent mortality by releasing an otherworldly cry that no living human throat could possibly produce, a sound described as simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, resembling both a woman's anguish and something far more ancient and inhuman. The historical context of banshee beliefs emerges directly from the pre-Christian Celtic understanding of liminal spaces between life and death, where certain supernatural entities were thought to occupy the boundary between our world and whatever lay beyond. And when Christian ideology eventually permeated Irish culture, these older beliefs were not erased, but rather recontextualized, the banshee becoming a tragic figure rather than purely a messenger. Often described as the ghost of a woman who died in terrible circumstances or who suffered profound loss, forever cursed to wander and warn her descendants of approaching death. The psychological mechanism operating beneath banshee beliefs functions through a combination of grief processing and the human need to create meaning from loss, as when families experience the death of a loved one, particularly an unexpected or tragic death, the narrative of a banshee's warning provided a framework through which that loss could be understood as somehow anticipated or cosmically acknowledged, transforming chaotic suffering into an ordered, almost ritualized experience where supernatural forces took notice of human mortality and considered it significant enough to announce. Furthermore, genuine auditory phenomena such as the distinctive calls of certain animals, the wind howling through particular geological formations, or the psychological effects of stress and anticipatory grief on the human ear could easily be reinterpreted as banshee cries, especially in rural areas where such sounds would be less common and more mysterious. And the power of suggestion would amplify this reinterpretation across generations as the belief became culturally embedded. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil represents a cosmological model so deeply embedded in Viking consciousness that it functioned as their primary framework for understanding death, existence, and the structure of reality itself. A massive ash tree whose roots and branches supposedly connected 9 distinct worlds or realms, each inhabited by different categories of beings, and according to this elaborate system. The souls of the dead did not simply vanish into oblivion, but instead traveled through these interconnected dimensions based on how they had lived and died. The Norse people believed that warriors who fell in battle would ascend to Asgard where Odin waited in his great hall called Valhalla, while those who died of sickness or old age would descend into Hel, a realm presided over by a goddess of the same name, and this wasn't viewed as punishment in the way Christian hell might be conceived, but rather as a natural destination appropriate to one's circumstances, a logical continuation of life's journey rather than eternal torment. The psychological mechanism behind this belief system reveals how humans construct complex narratives to address the fundamental terror of death by creating hierarchical afterlife destinations that validate different social roles and life experiences, transforming the random nature of mortality into a comprehensible system where a warrior's violent death carries significance and a laborer's peaceful one carries its own dignity. Rather than offering escape from death's inevitability, Yggdrasil's framework actually normalized death by positioning it as passage through a mapped territory, making the incomprehensible into something navigable and structured. What persists most strikingly about this mythology is how it illustrates that humans have always sought to create comprehensive cosmological systems that transform death from chaos into order, a pattern we see repeated across countless cultures and throughout history, and we continue this tradition today through various religious afterlife concepts, scientific multiverse theories, and even metaphorical understandings of legacy and memory, suggesting that the fundamental human need to situate ourselves within vast, interconnected systems may be as essential to our psychology as breathing itself. The Yggdrasil model particularly reveals how mythology functions as proto-psychology, allowing ancient peoples to externalize internal anxieties about mortality and meaning through elaborate cosmological architecture. Much like modern humans construct personal philosophies or digital identities to organize the overwhelming complexity of existence. In many spiritual and esoteric traditions spanning centuries across multiple continents, there exists a concept known as the etheric body, often described as an energetic double or subtle form that inhabits the same space as the physical body during life and allegedly separates from it at the moment of death. This ethereal counterpart is said to be composed of a finer substance than matter itself, a form of energy or vital force that maintains the shape and organization of the physical form while serving as a bridge between the material realm and higher planes of existence. Practitioners of various occult traditions, from 19th century theosophy to contemporary New Age spirituality, have spent considerable effort attempting to visualize, map, and interact with this supposed etheric layer, often claiming that damage to the etheric body can precede physical illness by months or years. The theory emerged most prominently during the Victorian era when spiritualism was at its height, offering a seemingly scientific explanation for phenomena that mediums claimed to witness, particularly the appearance of spirits or astral projections that seemed to retain human form and recognizable features. Theosophists like Helena Blavatsky elaborated extensively on the etheric body's composition, structure, and function, describing it as perceptible only to those who had developed sufficient spiritual sensitivity or undergone proper occult training. The psychological mechanism supporting belief in the etheric body appears deeply rooted in the human tendency to seek continuity and substantiality for consciousness itself. The troubling realization that our awareness and identity might simply cease to exist, propelling many toward theories that grant our consciousness or essential self a vehicle that transcends physical death. The etheric body represents a compromise between materialist science and spiritual yearning, a hypothesis that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of the brain, but rather something fundamental that requires its own subtle architecture to operate within and through. Furthermore, accounts of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences during meditation or anesthesia, and reported sightings of apparitions all seem to corroborate the existence of something that can separate from the body, lending apparent empirical weight to what remains fundamentally untestable and unfalsifiable. In cultures spanning from West Africa to East Asia, from indigenous communities in the Americas to the Pacific Islands, there exists a widespread and deeply held belief that deceased relatives continue to exist in a realm adjacent to our own, actively watching over and protecting their living descendants from harm, misfortune, and spiritual danger. This concept, known as the belief in guardian ancestors, manifests across remarkably different societies and time periods with striking consistency, suggesting something fundamental about how humans process grief, responsibility, and the continuation of family bonds beyond the threshold of death. Practitioners of these traditions report that ancestors serve as intermediaries between the living world and the divine or spiritual realm, intervening in moments of crisis, offering guidance through dreams and intuitive failings, and maintaining an invested interest in the welfare and moral behavior of their living relatives. The guardian ancestor belief system typically includes ritualistic elements such as making offerings of food, drink, or incense at ancestral shrines, speaking directly to deceased family members during times of need, and interpreting coincidences or fortunate events as evidence of ancestral intervention and protection. From a psychological perspective, this belief system functions as a profound mechanism for processing grief and loss by transforming the finality of death into a form of continued presence and relationship, allowing individuals to maintain emotional bonds with those they have loved and lost, while simultaneously creating a sense of cosmic order and familial continuity that extends beyond individual mortality. The guardian ancestor framework also serves to reinforce family loyalty and moral behavior, as the belief that ancestors are watching encourages living relatives to act ethically and honorably, knowing that their actions may displease or please those spiritual observers. What makes this belief system particularly resilient is its unfalsifiability. Any positive outcome can be attributed to ancestral protection, while any negative outcome can be explained through insufficient respect or improper ritual observance, creating a self-perpetuating explanatory system that absorbs contradictions and integrates them into its broader worldview. The ancient Egyptians developed one of history's most elaborate and time-consuming practices for preserving the dead, a process that could take up to 70 days and involved the systematic removal of internal organs, the application of natron salts, the wrapping of the body in linen strips, and the placement of amulets and charms throughout the layers of cloth. All with the belief that this physical preservation was absolutely essential for the soul's successful journey through the afterlife and its eventual resurrection in a realm beyond death. The bodies of pharaohs and wealthy individuals were placed in tombs filled with furniture, food, weapons, servants, and countless objects meant to sustain them in the next world, suggesting a deeply literal interpretation of the afterlife as a continuation of earthly existence that required the same material comforts and social hierarchies. This practice emerged from a psychological need to maintain continuity between the living and the dead, to deny the finality of death itself by suggesting that with proper preparation and preservation, the person could somehow endure eternally in a parallel existence that mirrored the life they had known. The underlying mechanism driving mummification was the human tendency to treat abstract anxieties about mortality through concrete, controllable actions, transforming the terror of death into a manageable project of preservation and preparation that gave families and communities a sense of agency and purpose during times of profound loss. By focusing on the technical requirements of mummification and the acquisition of burial goods, individuals could redirect their grief and existential dread into tangible work that felt meaningful and purposeful. Yet what remains striking is how this practice persisted across centuries despite offering no empirical evidence of effectiveness, and how societies invested enormous resources in these elaborate rituals while apparently never questioning whether the dead were actually benefiting from them or whether the afterlife they envisioned truly existed at all. Suggesting that the true value of mummification lay not in its claimed function, but in its ability to provide psychological comfort and social coherence to the living during their most vulnerable moments. In this sense, mummification functioned as a collective ritual that bound communities together through shared labor and belief, much like funerals and memorials do today, allowing the living to process grief through structured ceremony rather than being overwhelmed by raw emotion, and reminding us that many of our most enduring practices persist not because they solve problems, but because they help us live with them. In ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Chinese cosmologies, the concept of divine judges governing the afterlife emerged as a sophisticated response to the fundamental human need for cosmic justice and moral accountability. The ancient Egyptians envisioned Anubis and Osiris presiding over the weighing of the heart ceremony, where the souls of the deceased would have their hearts measured against the feather of truth, determining their ultimate fate in the afterlife, while the Greeks imagined Aeacus, Minos, and Rhadamanthys seated in the underworld as judges who would evaluate the deeds and moral character of the recently departed, assigning them to appropriate regions of Hades based on their earthly conduct. Similarly, Chinese religious traditions developed elaborate hierarchies of underworld magistrates and bureaucratic officials who maintained detailed records of human sins and virtues, conducting trials and dispensing punishments or rewards with the precision of an earthly administrative system. The psychological mechanism underlying these theories appears rooted in humanity's profound discomfort with the possibility that death might represent a complete erasure of consequence and meaning, coupled with our observation that earthly justice systems, while imperfect, do occasionally reward virtue and punish vice, leading us to project this pattern onto the cosmic realm as a comforting guarantee that moral wrongs will eventually be addressed by some higher authority. The concept assumes that the universe itself has been constructed with a built-in system of ultimate accountability, that no transgression goes unnoticed by celestial observers, and that the scales of justice, though sometimes appearing unbalanced during our lifetime, will ultimately be corrected after death through divine judgment. What remains striking is how persistently this image of posthumous judgment has survived into modern secular societies, where the literal belief in underworld judges may have faded, yet the underlying anxiety about moral reckoning and the hope for cosmic fairness continues to manifest in our cultural narratives, legal systems, and psychological expectations of eventual consequence and redemption. We see this impulse reflected in modern courtroom dramas, where justice systems are granted almost sacred authority, and in our collective fascination with narratives of karmic retribution, suggesting that even as we've abandoned literal judges beyond the grave, we remain psychologically invested in the belief that moral debts must eventually be paid, whether through law, fate, or the inexorable consequences of our own choices. Across numerous ancient and modern spiritual traditions, there exists a compelling belief that the human soul does not simply vanish upon death, but rather embarks on a journey of migration through different vessels, bodies, and forms of existence. This concept, known as soul migration or transmigration, suggests that consciousness itself is a fundamental, indestructible essence that moves from one living being to another in an endless cycle of rebirth and reincarnation. In Hinduism and Buddhism, this process is codified within the doctrine of samsara, where the soul accumulates karma through each lifetime and gradually progresses toward enlightenment or liberation. The ancient Greeks entertained similar notions through Pythagorean philosophy, which proposed that the soul of a human could be reborn into animals, plants, or even inanimate objects depending on the moral and spiritual quality of the previous life. Egyptian traditions held that the soul embarked on a perilous journey through the afterlife before potentially returning to inhabit a new earthly form. The psychological mechanism behind this belief appears rooted in humanity's profound discomfort with the concept of absolute non-existence and the observation that energy and matter transform rather than disappear in the physical world, leading to an intuitive extrapolation that consciousness must follow similar laws of conservation. The theory offers tremendous psychological comfort because it suggests that death is not an ending but a transition, that suffering and injustice in this life might be explained by previous actions or lives, and that spiritual progress continues indefinitely beyond the visible world. Despite the absence of empirical evidence or verifiable mechanisms for how a non-physical soul could interact with or transfer between physical bodies, this belief has persisted for thousands of years and continues to influence billions of people across multiple religions and cultures. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly normalized this concept has become in human consciousness, appearing not as a fringe belief, but as a central tenet within major world religions, suggesting that the human mind finds the narrative of soul migration far more palatable than the alternative. Perhaps this reveals less about the actual mechanics of consciousness and more about what the human psyche requires to feel safe in an uncertain universe, a framework that transforms the randomness of existence into a comprehensible moral order where every life has purpose and continuity. Imagine a philosophy so profound and so unsettling that it transforms the way you understand not only death, but the very meaning of existence itself. And this is the concept known as eternal return, a theory that emerged most prominently through the writings of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the 1880s, though the idea traces back through ancient Stoic and Hindu traditions, suggesting that the universe and all events within it repeat infinitely and eternally without variation or deviation. Meaning that your entire life, every moment you have ever experienced from birth to death, will occur again and again throughout infinite cycles of time, and you yourself will live through these identical moments with no memory of the previous iterations, experiencing the same joys and sorrows, the same conversations and silences, the same triumphs and failures in perpetual recurrence. The psychological mechanism that makes this theory so compelling and so troubling lies in its radical reframing of personal agency and responsibility. For if every moment of your existence is destined to repeat eternally, then the choices you make and the actions you take carry an almost infinite weight of consequence, not because they affect some distant future or eternal soul, but because they literally will happen again and again without end in precisely the same way. Which creates a peculiar kind of moral imperative where you must live your life as if it will repeat forever, treating each decision with the gravity it deserves under such circumstances. The mechanism functions psychologically by collapsing the distinction between this life and an afterlife into something altogether different, a recursive loop rather than a linear progression, which means that redemption, growth, and salvation must occur within the confines of a single lifetime repeated infinitely, and the afterlife is not a separate realm, but rather the eternal return to the beginning again. What remains remarkable about eternal return is how it persists in human consciousness despite offering no empirical evidence whatsoever and despite being ultimately unfalsifiable as a concept. Yet it has captured the imagination of philosophers, artists, and thinkers across centuries, perhaps because it provides a strange kind of comfort alongside its unsettling implications, transforming death from an ending into merely a reset. A guarantee that nothing you have been will ever truly be lost, but instead preserved in the infinite repetition of time itself, making your existence not temporary and fleeting, but eternal in its way, though in a manner far stranger than traditional conceptions of heaven or paradise could ever suggest.